At dinner, my son's wife pointed her silver fork right at my chest and smiled. "Move to the basement," she said. "We need your bedroom for the baby." I did not yell. I did not argue. I simply nodded, finished my steak, and started packing. 3 weeks later, I was sipping coffee on the porch of a beautiful beachfront home in the Gulf of Mexico, listening to the waves crash while they were forcefully evicted and lost absolutely everything they had. My name is Charles. I am 70 years old, and this is the story of how my silence became the loudest lesson my son ever learned. Before I share the details of this brutal betrayal, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that respect is earned, not demanded. The dining room of our sprawling Atlanta suburbs house was quiet save for the clinking of heavy silverware against expensive porcelain plates. I was peacefully cutting into my medium-rare steak when Megan, my 30-year-old daughter-in-law, suddenly stopped chewing. She wiped the corners of her mouth with a white linen napkin, looked directly across the table at me, and raised her fork, pointing the sharp silver prongs right at the center of my chest. "Charles, you need to move out of the master bedroom," she announced. Her voice was entirely casual, as if she were asking me to pass the salt or pour her another glass of water. "You are going to have to move your things to the basement. We need your room for the new baby." I paused, my knife resting gently on the porcelain plate. I looked across the mahogany table at my son Brandon. He was 35 years old, a middle manager at a logistics firm, a man who wore expensive suits and drove a car he could barely afford. But right now, sitting next to his wife, he looked like a terrified schoolboy caught in a lie. He kept his eyes locked firmly on his plate, aggressively pushing his mashed potatoes around with his fork, refusing to meet my gaze. "Brandon," I said. My voice was steady, low, and completely calm. "Is this true?" He finally glanced up, his eyes darting nervously toward his wife before looking back down at his food. "Well, Dad, you know how it is," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Babies need a lot of space. And the master bedroom has the attached nursery. Plus, the basement is really not that bad. We can get a heavy-duty dehumidifier to handle the damp smell down there. It will be cozy once you get your furniture set up." A dehumidifier for the damp smell. I stared at the boy I had raised with my own 2 hands. The boy I had spent countless hours teaching how to tie a Windsor knot, how to drive a manual transmission, how to stand tall and look a man directly in the eye when speaking difficult truths. Now he could not even look his own father in the eye while banishing him to a cold concrete cellar. Megan crossed her arms, leaning back in her upholstered dining chair. Her diamond wedding band caught the bright light of the crystal chandelier above us. "It makes the absolute most sense, Charles," she said, her tone dripping with a condescending sweetness. "You are just one person. You do not need all that space upstairs. Besides, my interior designer is coming next week to measure the master bedroom walls for custom nursery wallpaper. You need to be completely cleared out by Friday evening at the latest." I looked back and forth between the two of them. The sheer audacity of their demand hung in the air, thick and suffocating. But I did not give them the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. I did not raise my voice. I did not remind them of what I had sacrificed. I simply placed my knife and fork down, wiped my hands meticulously on my napkin, and stood up from the table. "I understand," I said quietly. "I will start packing my belongings tonight." The silence in the dining room was deafening as I walked away. I could feel their eyes burning into my back. They had expected a massive fight. They had desperately wanted me to scream and yell so they could label me an unreasonable old man so they could easily justify their cruelty to their friends. But I denied them that ammunition. As a former head engineer for one of the largest commercial shipping companies in the American South, I learned a very long time ago that reacting with pure emotion during a sudden crisis is the absolute fastest way to lose control of the situation. You do not shout at a failing engine block. You analyze it, you diagnose the fatal flaw, and you dismantle it piece by piece. I walked up the carpeted stairs to the massive master bedroom, a room that always felt entirely too large and empty without my late wife, Evelyn. I walked into the walk-in closet and pulled 2 large, heavy leather suitcases from the top shelf. As I began carefully folding my dress shirts and placing them inside, a bitter, stinging irony washed over me. I stopped for a moment and looked around at the expensive crown molding the large bay windows overlooking the manicured lawn and the pristine hardwood floors. This 4-bedroom house in an upscale Atlanta neighborhood did not belong to Brandon. Not in spirit, and certainly not in financial reality. 5 years ago, when Brandon was drowning in massive credit card debt, facing lawsuits from collection agencies and barely keeping his head above water, I made a massive sacrifice. I sold the beautiful, comfortable home Evelyn and I had shared for 3 decades. I took the cash from that sale, every single penny of my life savings, and I bought this Atlanta house outright. I paid in pure cash. There was no mortgage. There were no lingering bank loans. I bought it free and clear so my only son would have a stable foundation to build his future upon. But I made one crucial, fatal mistake driven entirely by a grieving father's blind love. To save Brandon from the heavy burden of estate and inheritance taxes later down the line, when I eventually passed away, I allowed the official property deed to be drafted exclusively in his name. Legally, on government paper, it was his house. I had handed him the keys to a financial fortress, trusting completely that he would never raise the drawbridge against the old man who built it. Now, the very walls I had purchased with my life's work were being taken from me by a daughter-in-law who had contributed absolutely nothing to this family but arrogance and debt. I picked up a framed photograph of Evelyn from my nightstand and placed it gently into my suitcase, running my thumb over the cold glass. She would have been absolutely furious. She would have marched downstairs and thrown them both out onto the street without a second thought. But I was not Evelyn. I was Charles. I was a man of complex systems, of architectural blueprints, of cold, hard logic. I zipped the first leather suitcase closed. The basement was damp, yes, but it was also quiet, and I needed absolute quiet to think about my next move. By Thursday evening, the master bedroom was entirely empty. I had moved my heavy oak bed frame, my small reading desk, and all my clothes down the narrow, creaking wooden stairs into the unfinished basement. The air down there was thick and heavy, smelling faintly of old mildew-wet earth and accumulated dust. The only natural light came from two small, grated windows near the ceiling, casting long prison-like shadows across the cold concrete floor. I was quietly arranging my engineering textbooks on a small metal shelf when I realized I had forgotten a wooden box of Evelyn's antique watches in the upstairs hallway linen closet. Not wanting to leave them behind for Megan's hired movers to carelessly toss around, I quietly walked back up the basement stairs. The heavy door at the top of the stairwell was slightly ajar, letting a sliver of warm light into the dark stairwell. As I reached my hand out for the brass door handle, I heard Megan's voice drifting clearly from the open kitchen. She was on her cell phone, laughing loudly, the sound of a wine glass clinking against the granite countertop echoing in the room. Her tone was completely different from the cold, measured, disrespectful voice she always used with me. It was giddy. It was triumphant. It was the sound of a hunter admiring a fresh kill. "I know, Mom," I know, Megan giggled enthusiastically into the receiver. "Yes, we finally got him out of the room. He is down in the dungeon now. I honestly cannot believe how easy it was. Brandon just nodded along like a good little boy. He is so terrified of me leaving him and taking half his salary in a divorce, he will literally agree to anything I say." I froze instantly on the top step, the old wood creaking slightly beneath my weight. I held my breath, keeping my hand hovering over the doorknob, listening closely to the poison spilling from her lips. "No, Mom, listen to me," Megan continued, her voice dropping to an excited, rapid whisper. "You and Dad need to start packing the rental truck this weekend. The master bedroom is absolutely huge. It has a giant walk-in shower and double vanities. It will be completely perfect for you guys to move into." My blood ran ice cold in my veins. My heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "What about the baby?" Megan suddenly said, repeating a question her mother must have asked. Megan laughed sharply, a cruel, piercing sound that cut through the quiet house. "Mom, there is no baby. I just stopped taking my birth control pills last week. I only said I was pregnant so the old man would not argue about giving up the master suite. It was the absolute perfect excuse. Once you and Dad are fully moved in, what is he going to do? Complain. He has nowhere else to go. All his money is tied up in this place. We have him completely trapped. Just get here by Sunday morning." She ended the call abruptly, humming a cheerful, upbeat pop song as she opened the stainless steel refrigerator to pour herself another glass of expensive wine. I stood completely still in the dark shadows of the stairwell, my hand gripping the wooden railing so tightly my knuckles turned white. There was no baby. There was no innocent, familial reason for my sudden banishment to the cellar. I was not making way for a beloved grandchild. I was being ruthlessly discarded, thrown into a damp concrete hole so that my daughter-in-law could import her own parents to live in luxury on my dime. They truly thought they had me trapped. They thought, because I was a 70-year-old man, because I had foolishly signed the property deed over to my weak-willed son, that I was a toothless old lion just waiting to die quietly in the dark. I slowly backed down the stairs, retreating step by step into the cold basement. I did not feel the dampness in the air anymore. I did not smell the mildew. All I felt was absolute crystal clear focus. They had deeply mistaken my silence for weakness. They had mistaken my advanced age for incompetence. I sat down at my small desk in the dim light of the basement, pulling my old heavy leather engineering briefcase onto my lap. I popped the twin brass locks open with a sharp click. It was time to show them exactly what kind of trap they had just walked into. The loud, obnoxious roar of a poorly maintained diesel engine shattered the quiet Sunday morning. I was sitting at my small desk in the basement reviewing a stack of old property documents from my open briefcase when I heard the heavy crunch of tires violently mounting the driveway curb. Heavy footsteps pounded above me on the main floor, followed by the shrill, excited squeal of Megan greeting her parents. I slowly closed my briefcase, locked the brass clasps, and walked up the wooden stairs. When I opened the basement door, the invasion was already in full swing. Gary and Susan had arrived. Gary was a loud, heavy-set man with a permanent sunburn and a stained baseball cap, while Susan trailed behind him carrying a cheap plastic cooler. They did not even bother to take off their muddy boots as they stomped across the pristine hardwood floors I had paid to install. "Oh, the master bedroom is right up the stairs, Dad," Megan chimed happily, pointing toward the second floor. "It is completely empty and ready for you both." Gary let out a booming, abrasive laugh, slapping his thick hand against the mahogany banister. "Fantastic," he bellowed. "I told Susan we needed a real upgrade. This place is a mansion compared to our old spot." As he turned toward the kitchen, Gary finally noticed me standing quietly in the doorway of the basement. He did not offer a handshake. He did not offer a polite greeting. He looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Well, if it is not the old man," Gary said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Here you got a new apartment downstairs. Good for you. Less stairs to climb at your age." Before I could respond, Gary reached into the pocket of his faded jeans, pulled out a heavy ring of keys, and tossed them directly at my chest. I caught them reflexively. "Do me a favor, Charles," Gary said, turning his back to me and walking toward the refrigerator. "The highway bugs are plastered all over my windshield and the rims are caked in mud. Be a good host and give my truck a wash out in the driveway, will you? I need it shining before I drive into the city tomorrow." Brandon walked into the kitchen just in time to see his father-in-law treat me like a hired servant. My son looked at the keys in my hand, swallowed hard, and quickly looked down at his shoes, entirely silent. I did not throw the keys back at Gary. I did not demand respect. I simply closed my hand around the cold metal, turned around, and walked out the front door into the sweltering Georgia heat. The truck was a massive rusted eyesore, leaking dark oil onto my immaculate concrete driveway. I picked up the green garden hose, grabbed a bucket and a sponge from the garage, and began to wash the mud from the massive tires. As the cold water washed over the grimy hubcaps, my mind traveled back over the last 40 years of my life. For 4 decades, I served as the head engineer for one of the most profitable commercial shipping enterprises on the East Coast. I managed multi-million-dollar logistics networks, optimized complex global supply chains, and commanded the absolute respect of hundreds of technicians and corporate executives. I built my entire life on the foundation of rigorous intellectual discipline, precise calculation, and unwavering accountability. My late wife, Evelyn, and I built a legacy from nothing but hard work and mutual respect. And now I was standing in my own driveway, scrubbing the dead insects off the windshield of a man who probably had not read a single book since high school. The sheer ignorance of Gary and Susan was staggering. They strutted into my home with an arrogant entitlement, completely oblivious to the fact that the very ground they were walking on was legally tethered to my name. They mistook my compliance for submission. They assumed that because I was an elderly African-American man who quietly accepted a chore, I possessed no power, no intellect, and no leverage to strike back. But what Gary did not understand is that an engineer never performs a menial task without an underlying purpose. Washing this truck was not a submission to his authority. It was a golden opportunity to conduct a thorough inspection of his vehicle without drawing any suspicion. I meticulously washed the exterior, letting the water run clear, while my mind organized the legal statutes of property law and eviction procedures. I needed to know exactly what kind of financial situation my son had tangled himself in with these parasites. I needed raw data. And as I opened the heavy driver's side door to wipe down the dusty interior dashboard, the data practically fell right into my hands. The inside of Gary's truck was a disaster. Fast food wrappers, empty soda cans, and crumpled receipts littered the passenger floorboard. The smell of stale tobacco and cheap cologne was overwhelmingly pungent. I took a damp microfiber cloth and began wiping down the sticky steering wheel and the center console. As I reached his glove compartment, the poorly maintained latch snapped open, spilling a massive stack of disorganized paperwork onto the dirty floor mat. I let out a quiet sigh and crouched down to gather the scattered documents. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Unpaid toll violations, final notices from collection agencies, and overdue utility bills. Gary was drowning in debt. But as I gathered the final few papers near the brake pedal, a thick, unopened envelope caught my eye. It was made of premium heavy stock paper, completely different from the cheap collection notices. I picked it up, expecting to see Gary or Susan's name printed on the front. Instead, the bold, black ink staring back at me made my breath catch in my throat. The name printed on the envelope was Charles. My name. Not Brandon, not Megan, but me. I stared at the envelope, my mind racing through a dozen logical permutations. I carefully examined the destination address. It did not list my house in Atlanta. It listed a random post office box located 2 towns over. Someone was deliberately routing official mail in my name to a secure location where I could never possibly see it. I wiped my hands completely dry on my jeans and carefully tore the edge of the envelope open. I slid the thick multi-page document out into the sunlight. It was a consolidated bank statement from a major national lender. But it was not a statement for my checking or savings account. It was a massive, high-interest revolving credit account, and the current balance was staggering. According to the document in my hands, I had recently authorized a massive line of credit, and the funds had been heavily depleted over the past 3 weeks. There were large withdrawals made out to a local automotive dealership, a luxury furniture store, and several offshore online gambling websites. My identity had been stolen. Not by a random hacker on the internet, but by the people sleeping under my own roof. Brandon and Megan were not just trying to force me out of my bedroom, they were systematically draining my financial identity to fund the luxurious lifestyle of her parasitic parents. I carefully folded the bank statement, slid it securely into my back pocket, and tossed the rest of the junk mail back into the glove compartment. I closed the heavy truck door, turned off the garden hose, and walked calmly back toward the house. The time for quietly packing boxes in the basement was officially over. Tomorrow morning, when the bank opened its doors, I was going to follow the money, and then I was going to call my lawyer. The sun had barely risen over the Atlanta suburbs when I quietly gathered my things. The massive house was still entirely silent, save for the obnoxious rhythmic snoring coming from the upstairs master bedroom where Gary and Susan were sleeping. The air in the hallway already reeked of the cheap domestic beer Gary had been drinking until 3 in the morning. I slipped on my jacket, picked up my keys, and left a small, neatly written note on the kitchen island. The note simply stated that I had gone out early to the grocery store to pick up supplies for the week. It was a perfectly mundane excuse, the kind of domestic chore they fully expected their newly appointed basement servant to handle. But I did not drive to the local grocery store. I merged onto the morning highway and drove straight to the downtown branch of the First National Bank. I walked through the heavy glass doors the absolute second they opened to the public. The air conditioning was sharp and cold against my skin. I did not bother waiting in the general teller line. I walked directly to the glass-enclosed office of the senior branch manager, a man named David, who had personally handled my massive cash deposits for over a decade. I sat down across from his polished oak desk and slid my state driver license across the smooth surface. "Good morning, Mr. Charles," David said with a polite, professional smile. "How can we help you today?" "I need a comprehensive pull of my entire credit history," I told him, my voice completely devoid of any emotion or pleasantries. "Every single open account, every line of credit, every recent hard inquiry, and every transaction attached to my social security number. I need it right now." David blinked, surprised by my sudden intensity, but he did not argue. He immediately began typing on his keyboard, the blue light of his monitor reflecting in his wire-rimmed glasses. As he scrolled through the data, his polite customer service smile slowly vanished. The color completely drained from his face. He leaned closer to the screen, his brow furrowing in deep concern. "Mr. Charles?" He hesitated, his voice dropping to a nervous whisper. "When exactly did you authorize the $250,000 home equity line of credit against your primary residence?" I did not blink. I kept my hands folded neatly on my lap, staring directly into his panicked eyes. "Print the entire file, David," I commanded. "All 50 pages of it if you have to. I need to see the original loan application, the signature pages, the routing numbers, and the complete transaction history." David hurried to the heavy laser printer in the corner of his office when he finally handed me the thick stack of warm papers. The first page hit me harder than a physical blow, even though I had already suspected the worst. There it was, printed in cold black and white. A massive home equity line of credit, commonly known as a HELOC, completely secured against the very house I had purchased with my life savings. Brandon had deliberately leveraged the property. Because Brandon had a terrible personal credit score from years of foolish spending, the bank had strictly required a wealthy guarantor with an immaculate financial standing to approve the loan. That guarantor was supposedly me. I stared at the bottom of the loan agreement. It was my name on the dotted line, but the handwriting was a clumsy, desperate forgery. The loops were entirely wrong. The slant of the letters was far too aggressive. It was the messy handwriting of a panicked 35-year-old boy trying desperately to mimic the steady, precise hand of a 70-year-old engineer. I turned the page to the transaction history, and the reality of their greed washed over me. The borrowed money was vanishing at a terrifying, reckless speed. $80,000 had been wired directly to a shady offshore sports betting syndicate to completely wipe out Gary's massive gambling debts. $65,000 had been paid to a local luxury automotive dealership to purchase that rusted diesel truck currently dripping oil onto my driveway. Tens of thousands more had been siphoned off to high-end furniture stores and expensive boutique clothing shops for Megan. They were not just treating my home like a free hotel. They had successfully turned my legacy into a personal automated teller machine to fund a white trash royal family. My own son had committed severe federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft just to keep his demanding, arrogant wife happy. The sheer scale of the betrayal should have broken my heart. It should have brought me to tears right there in the bank lobby. But I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculated clarity. The traditional mourning period for my son ended the exact moment he banished me to the damp basement. I was no longer a grieving father looking at a disappointed child. I was an engineer looking at a critical structural failure. And it was time for a highly controlled demolition. David, the bank manager, looked absolutely terrified. He reached for his desk phone. "Mr. Charles, this looks highly irregular and incredibly illegal," he whispered urgently, leaning across the oak desk. "If you did not physically sign these loan documents, we need to immediately alert the bank fraud department and call the federal authorities. Your son could face severe federal prison time for this level of financial deception." I looked up from the forged papers and calmly slid the entire stack into my heavy leather briefcase. I snapped the brass lock shut with a sharp final click. "No, David," I replied smoothly, standing up from the chair. "Do not flag the account just yet. Let the line of credit remain completely open and active for now. I will handle this family matter personally." I walked out of the air-conditioned bank and stepped back into the oppressive morning heat. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, gripping the leather steering wheel. Any normal, emotionally reactive man would have driven straight to the local police station. But sending Brandon to jail right now was entirely too merciful. If he went to prison today, Megan and her parasitic parents would simply file for bankruptcy, play the innocent victims, and continue living comfortably in my house, while the slow legal system dragged its feet for years. They needed to feel the absolute terror of losing the very ground beneath their feet. They needed to be standing at the absolute peak of their unearned arrogance when the trapdoor finally opened. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed a private number I had not called in over 5 years. It rang twice before a sharp, commanding voice answered. Jonathan Hayes was not just a standard real estate attorney. He was a legal predator, a man who charged $800 an hour to financially dissect people without an ounce of mercy. "Hello, Charles," Jonathan said. "To what do I owe this rare pleasure on a Monday morning?" I turned the ignition key, feeling the engine hum to life. "Jonathan," I said, my voice completely flat and hollow. 5 years ago, when we drafted the property deed for the Atlanta house, you insisted I include a very specific hidden safeguard, Clause 7. The immediate revocation of ownership rights in the event of financial fraud or moral turpitude. Jonathan chuckled darkly on the other end of the line. "I remember it perfectly, Charles. I told you never to hand over a castle without keeping a secret key to the main gate. I assume the boy finally made a stupid mistake. He forged my signature as a guarantor on a $250,000 equity loan to pay off his father-in-law gambling debts," I stated simply. The line went completely silent for a long moment. When Jonathan spoke again, all the casual humor was gone from his voice. The legal machinery was already spinning violently in his head. "Bring me the forged bank documents by noon today, Charles. What are your exact orders?" I pulled out of the bank parking lot, steering my car toward the highway. "Prepare the deed revocation immediately," I commanded. "Strip his name from the title today. And Jonathan, find a corporate buyer. Someone completely ruthless. I want this house sold out from under them for pure cash before the week is over. The hunt begins right now." By Saturday afternoon, the intense Georgia heat had settled over the neighborhood like a thick, suffocating blanket. The temperature had pushed past 100 degrees, but that did not stop Megan from throwing what she aggressively marketed as a lavish housewarming barbecue. The sprawling backyard was completely transformed into a scene of ridiculous excess. Expensive vintage string lights, undoubtedly paid for by the stolen equity of my home, were draped elegantly across the entire patio. A massive catered tent was set up near Evelyn's old manicured garden, and at least 50 of their friends were drinking imported beer and laughing loudly. Megan was dressed in a pristine white designer sundress, holding a crystal glass of expensive champagne, playing the perfect suburban hostess. She walked her affluent friends through the massive living room, pointing out the custom crown molding and the expensive hardwood floors, loudly boasting about how hard her husband Brandon had worked to buy this beautiful property. She told everyone it was his dream home, a testament to his incredible success at the corporate logistics firm. Brandon stood right beside her, grinning foolishly, completely ignoring the fact that he was standing on stolen ground. Meanwhile, I was banished to the far, dusty corner of the backyard, standing directly over a massive charcoal grill. Gary had ordered me to cook the steaks and burgers for all of their guests. I was sweating profusely through my light cotton shirt, the thick gray smoke stinging my eyes as the relentless afternoon sun beat down heavily on my neck. I was treated exactly like the hired help. They did not introduce me to a single guest. They did not even offer me a glass of cold tap water. Whenever someone asked who the old man at the grill was, Megan would simply wave her perfectly manicured hand and say, "I was just Brandon's father who needed a place to stay," making it sound as if they had generously rescued me from absolute homelessness. I kept my head down and continued turning the thick cuts of meat with a pair of metal tongs. I did not complain about the blistering heat. I did not confront Megan about the ridiculous lies she was loudly telling her friends. I simply watched the fat drip from the steaks onto the glowing red coals, listening to the loud hissing sound of the fire and waiting for my moment. About an hour into the party, the disrespect reached a new peak. Gary stumbled over to the grilling station with one of his loud, obnoxious friends trailing closely behind him. The friend was a tall, heavy-set man with a badly sunburned neck, holding a half-empty beer bottle and chewing loudly on a toothpick. Gary slapped his friend hard on the shoulder and pointed a thick, greasy finger directly at me. "Hey, Charles!" Gary barked over the loud music playing from the outdoor patio speakers. "Make sure those expensive ribeyes are cooked medium rare. We do not want you ruining the good meat with your old shaky hands." His friend let out a harsh, barking laugh that smelled strongly of cheap alcohol. "It is real nice of your successful son to let you crash down in his damp basement, old man," the friend sneered, taking a long sip of his beer. "Most guys your age end up rotting in a cheap county nursing home when they go completely broke. You better make sure you flip those burgers right, or they might just send you packing to the streets." The sheer, unadulterated disrespect hung heavily in the humid air. Several other guests standing nearby stopped talking and turned to watch, waiting eagerly to see how I would react to the public humiliation. Brandon was standing less than 20 feet away by the garden fence holding a plate of food. He heard every single word of the insult. He saw the mocking smiles on their sweaty faces. But my son simply turned his back and walked toward the patio, completely abandoning his father to the wolves just to save face in front of his wife. I looked directly into the bloodshot eyes of Gary's arrogant friend. I did not frown. I did not show an ounce of anger or wounded pride. I simply nodded slowly, picked up a perfectly seared steak, and placed it carefully on the silver serving platter. "I am making sure everything is done exactly right," I said in a calm, completely even voice. As they walked away, laughing and slapping each other on the back, my mind drifted away from the blistering heat and the choking smoke. I thought about the phone call I had made to my lawyer, Jonathan Hayes, earlier that week. I thought about the intricate legal mechanisms that were already grinding into motion behind the scenes. They thought I was a pathetic, broken old man who had lost his fortune and his dignity. They had absolutely no idea that I was simply a patient engineer waiting for the structural integrity of their stolen life to completely collapse. When the last of the food was finally served and the guests were busy eating, I stepped away from the sweltering grill. My back ached terribly and my clothes were completely soaked in sweat, but my mind was sharper and colder than ever. I walked quietly through the crowded, noisy house, ignoring the arrogant stares of Megan's friends, and slipped into the downstairs guest bathroom. I locked the heavy wooden door behind me and turned on the cold water faucet, splashing my face to wash away the thick grease and smoke. The cool water felt incredibly refreshing against my skin. I dried my face with a soft hand towel and looked at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were entirely calm-focused and completely devoid of mercy. I reached down and opened the small wooden cabinet beneath the marble sink where I had secretly hidden my heavy leather engineering briefcase earlier that morning. I placed the briefcase on the closed toilet seat and popped the twin brass locks open with a loud, satisfying click. Inside, safely tucked beneath a layer of old architectural blueprints and property tax receipts, was a thick manila envelope. I pulled the envelope out and carefully extracted the original copy of the deed of trust for the house. The thick parchment paper felt heavy and deeply authoritative in my hands. I flipped past the first few pages of standard legal jargon, running my index finger down the dense printed text until I reached the final page. There it was, shining like a beacon of absolute destruction. Clause 7. I read the words silently to myself, the strict legal terminology sounding like absolute poetry in my mind. The grantor retains the absolute and immediate right to revoke the transfer of ownership and reclaim the property in full, without prior notice to the grantee in the event of financial fraud, forgery, or moral turpitude committed against the grantor. It was the ultimate failsafe, a legal guillotine waiting patiently for the executioner to pull the heavy iron lever. I had drafted this exact clause with Jonathan 5 years ago because I knew deep down that my son was easily manipulated and financially reckless. I just never expected I would actually have to use it against him. Now accompanied by the forged home equity loan documents currently sitting on Jonathan's mahogany desk downtown, Clause 7 was fully armed and ready to fire. I carefully folded the heavy deed and placed it securely in my inner jacket pocket. Brandon and Megan were outside right now drinking expensive champagne and pretending to be the wealthy rulers of the suburbs. But holding that piece of paper, I knew the absolute truth. They were completely broke. They were guilty of severe federal crimes. And by the time the sun set on this miserable barbecue, I would officially activate the revocation and sell the very ground beneath their feet. I unlocked the bathroom door and stepped back out into the hallway, ready to let them enjoy their final few days in my house. I retreated to the damp basement as the loud music from the backyard finally began to fade into the humid evening air. The obnoxious, housewarming barbecue was winding down, leaving behind the heavy stench of cheap beer, charred meat, and stale cigarette smoke. I walked down the creaking wooden stairs, my legs aching from standing over the hot coals for 4 hours straight. I sat heavily on the edge of my thick oak bed, staring up at the exposed wooden joists of the ceiling to gather my thoughts. That was when I noticed it. A small circular plastic device was mounted directly above my small reading desk. It looked exactly like a standard white smoke detector, the kind you buy for $10 at any local hardware store. But as a man who spent 40 years designing intricate electrical and mechanical systems, my eyes immediately caught the glaring anomaly. There was no internal wiring running along the wooden joists to connect the device to the main power grid of the house, and the placement directly over a desk was entirely illogical for basic fire safety. I stood up on my wooden chair and leaned in close, inspecting the white plastic shell. Hidden perfectly inside the ventilation grill was a tiny glass pinhole camera lens. Beside it, a faint blue LED light blinked rhythmically, indicating it was actively recording audio and video and transmitting the data to a wireless network. Megan was spying on me. She had invaded the absolute last miserable sanctuary she had left me. I stepped down from the chair, carefully making sure not to look directly at the hidden lens again. She was recording my every move, watching me like a dangerous prisoner in a maximum security cell. Why would she go through the trouble and expense of buying and installing surveillance equipment in a damp basement? The forged home equity loan was already successfully secured. They already had the cash to buy their luxury cars and pay off Gary's gambling debts. There had to be a second, much darker motive at play. I sat back down at my desk and opened my heavy laptop, making sure my screen was angled sharply away from the hidden lens above. I logged into my home network router, tracing the connected wireless IP addresses. The hidden camera was streaming directly to an application on Megan's personal cell phone. They were actively building a portfolio of my private behavior. They were waiting patiently for me to do something foolish, something erratic, something that would prove I was no longer a capable adult. The next morning, I waited in my car, parked 2 blocks away from the house, sipping black coffee from a thermos. When Brandon finally pulled out of the driveway in his clean sedan, I followed him closely at a safe, unnoticeable distance. He did not drive toward the downtown financial district to his corporate logistics office. Instead, he drove out to a rundown, depressing commercial strip mall on the far outskirts of the city. He parked in front of a small, heavily tinted storefront with a faded plastic sign that read, "Advanced Neurology and Cognitive Care." I sat in my car, watching carefully through a pair of small binoculars. Brandon stood outside the shady clinic, nervously smoking a cigarette and checking his phone before walking inside. As the heavy glass door closed behind him, it all clicked into place with horrifying mathematical clarity. A shady, low-rent neurologist operating out of a cheap strip mall, the hidden surveillance camera in the basement, Megan constantly complaining to her affluent friends about my advanced age and supposed forgetfulness. The stolen $250,000 from the home equity loan was simply not enough to satisfy their endless greed. They knew I had a massive corporate engineering pension and a highly substantial private retirement account, but they could not simply forge a signature on a piece of paper to access those heavily guarded federal funds. They needed absolute, undeniable legal control over my person. They were conspiring to have me officially declared medically unfit and mentally incompetent. If they could present curated video evidence of my supposed cognitive decline to a corrupt or careless doctor, they could easily secure a comprehensive medical and financial power of attorney. They would legally lock me away in a miserable state, run nursing homes, sell the rest of my personal assets, and drain my life savings dry while I rotted alone in a wheelchair. The sheer, calculating evil of my own son was breathtaking. He was not just stealing my money, he was actively planning to erase my freedom entirely. I lowered the binoculars and started my car engine. A profound sense of cold, absolute detachment washed over me. Any lingering trace of paternal hesitation vanished instantly into the humid morning air. If they desperately wanted a helpless, senile old man who was slowly losing his grip on reality, I was going to give them an award-winning performance. I drove back to the house and quietly returned to my basement cell. The tiny blue light on the fake smoke detector was still blinking, steadily hungry for any sign of weakness. It was time to feed the beast. Later that evening, I heard Brandon and Megan walking heavily across the floorboards right above my head. I knew they were sitting on the expensive living room sofa, likely reviewing the live camera footage on her phone. I walked over to the small folding table where I kept my personal items. I picked up my thick leather wallet, deliberately making sure my hands trembled slightly as I held it. I furrowed my brow, adopting an expression of deep, helpless confusion. I slowly paced back and forth across the cold concrete floor, muttering quietly to myself as if I had completely lost my train of thought and forgot where I was. I walked over to the small, cheap microwave I had set up on a wooden crate in the corner of the room. I opened the microwave door, stared blankly inside for a long, uncomfortable moment, and then deliberately placed my heavy leather wallet right on the glass turntable. I closed the door, pressed a few random buttons without actually starting the machine, and then walked away, rubbing my temples intensely, as if I was suffering from a severe, disorienting migraine. I lay down on my bed, pulled the thin blanket up to my chest, and closed my eyes. Less than 10 minutes later, I heard the rapid, excited thumping of footsteps running down the wooden basement stairs. I kept my eyes closed and my breathing slow and steady, pretending to be fast asleep. The basement door swung open quietly. Brandon and Megan crept into the damp room. I could hear the sheer, unfiltered excitement in Megan's frantic whispers. "I told you, Brandon," she hissed quietly. "Look in the microwave right now. I got the whole thing on video. He is completely losing his mind. He put his wallet in there instead of his food." I heard the microwave door click open. "See," Megan whispered, her voice trembling with greedy anticipation as she pulled the wallet out. "This is exactly all the proof we need for the doctor at the clinic. We can get the medical power of attorney signed by the end of the week." Brandon let out a nervous, breathless laugh. "You were right," he whispered back. "He really is losing it. We can finally take over the retirement accounts and put him in a home." They quietly slipped back upstairs, entirely convinced they had just secured the final devastating nail in my coffin. I opened my eyes in the dark, staring directly up at the blinking blue light of their hidden camera. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. They thought they had outsmarted a 70-year-old man, but they had just eagerly swallowed a poisoned bait. By actively convincing them my mind was failing, I was violently pushing them to execute their final, desperate move. They were going to bring me that legal document to sign. And when they finally did, they would unknowingly detonate the massive trap I had built with Jonathan. The end was approaching incredibly fast, and it was going to be absolutely spectacular. The very next morning, the heavy wooden door at the top of the basement stairs swung open with a sharp creak. Heavy footsteps descended the steps much faster and more deliberate than usual. It was Brandon. He was dressed in his sharp corporate suit, but his tie was slightly crooked and his eyes darted nervously around the damp room. He was holding a thick manila folder tightly against his chest. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, staring blankly at the concrete wall, maintaining the carefully crafted illusion of a broken mind. Brandon pulled up my small wooden reading chair and sat down directly facing me. He cleared his throat loudly, trying to adopt a tone of deep paternal concern which sounded completely unnatural coming from him. "Dad, we need to have a very serious conversation." Brandon began, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed adrenaline. "Megan and I have been watching you closely over the past few days. We saw what happened last night with your wallet and the microwave. You are clearly struggling, and we are incredibly worried about your safety." He opened the manila folder and pulled out a thick stack of dense legal documents. He smoothed them out on my lap with shaking hands. "I have spoken to a medical specialist and a lawyer." He continued, lying through his teeth with practiced ease. "They strongly recommended that we set up a comprehensive medical and financial power of attorney. It is just a standard precaution, Dad. It simply gives me the legal authority to manage your healthcare decisions and protect your retirement accounts if you ever become fully incapacitated. It is entirely for your own good, so you never have to worry about paying bills or dealing with doctors again. All you need to do is sign at the bottom of these 3 pages, and I will take care of absolutely everything else." I looked up from the papers and stared directly into his eyes. There was no genuine concern there. There was only a ravenous, consuming greed. He was practically vibrating with anticipation. He thought he was minutes away from securing total, undisputed control over my life savings and my massive corporate pension. I could hear the faint creak of the upper stairs. Megan was standing just out of sight, listening intently to ensure her husband did not lose his nerve at the final moment. I slowly reached out and took the expensive silver pen from his hand. I made sure my fingers trembled violently as they wrapped around the cool metal barrel. I let out a long, heavy sigh, lowering my shoulders to project a posture of absolute defeat and quiet surrender. "If you really think this is best, Brandon," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly at the end of the sentence. He nodded eagerly, practically shoving the signature page closer to my chest. "It is for the best, Dad, I promise you," he replied quickly. I lowered my head and pressed the tip of the pen against the thick parchment paper. As I prepared to sign away my entire life, my mind flashed back to a late-night conversation I had with my attorney, Jonathan Hayes, more than 5 years ago. We were sitting in his downtown office drinking scotch, discussing the rising rates of elder financial abuse. Jonathan had warned me that the most dangerous weapon a greedy relative could wield was a power of attorney. But he also taught me the ultimate defense against it. A federal financial institution will only honor a sweeping transfer of high-value retirement assets if the legal identity on the document matches their internal records with absolute perfection. My legal name printed on every single bank account, pension fund, and government document is Charles Marcus Wright. But as I dragged the silver pen across the dotted line, I did not write my true name. With a slow, deliberate, and shaky hand, I signed the document as Charles Harrison Wright. It was a subtle, almost invisible discrepancy. To a careless, greedy son rushing to steal his father's money, it looked perfectly legitimate. But to a federal bank compliance system, that wrong middle initial was the equivalent of a massive, blaring financial fire alarm. It legally nullified the entire document and instantly flagged the transaction as a high-level identity mismatch. I painstakingly repeated the false signature on the second and third pages. Brandon did not even bother to read the ink. The absolute second I lifted the pen from the final page, he snatched the manila folder out of my hands with terrifying speed. "Thank you, Dad," he said breathlessly, already standing up and turning his back to me. I will handle it from here. You just get some rest." He practically sprinted up the wooden stairs, entirely eager to deliver the stolen prize to his waiting wife. I sat alone in the quiet basement, listening to the heavy front door slam shut upstairs. Through the small grated window near the ceiling, I heard the aggressive roar of Brandon's car engine as he sped out of the driveway, heading straight for the downtown financial district. He was not going to work. He was going directly to the main branch of my bank to immediately drain my private retirement accounts and seize control of my corporate pension. I leaned back against my pillows, crossed my arms behind my head, and mentally visualized the exact sequence of events that were about to unfold. Brandon would confidently walk into the bank, probably wearing his best corporate smile, and present the freshly signed manila folder to a senior teller. He would demand a total transfer of all liquid assets into a new joint account controlled entirely by him and Megan. The teller would scan the legal document into their secure federal database. The system algorithm would immediately cross-reference the signature identity against my established 40-year financial history. Within seconds, the computer would detect the incorrect middle initial. But it would not just reject the transfer. Because the requested amount involved hundreds of thousands of dollars in protected retirement funds, the system would automatically trigger a severe fraud protocol. It would instantly freeze every single account tied to my Social Security number, locking the funds behind an impenetrable federal firewall that no local branch manager could override. Brandon would be left standing at the marble counter, completely empty-handed and publicly humiliated. Exactly 2 hours later, the screech of tires echoed loudly from the street. The front door of the house was violently thrown open, hitting the interior wall with a massive, echoing crash. Heavy, furious footsteps stomped across the living room floor, accompanied by the muffled, panicked voice of Megan trying to calm him down. The basement door was ripped open so forcefully that it tore the metal hinges loose. Brandon charged down the wooden stairs like a wild animal. His corporate suit jacket was completely gone. His tie was ripped halfway off his neck, and his face was flushed bright red with pure, uncontrollable rage. He was clutching the manila folder so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He stopped just inches from my bed, towering over me, his chest heaving with heavy breaths. "You think you are so incredibly smart, old man?" he screamed, his voice echoing violently off the concrete walls. "You think this is a game?" The bank rejected the papers. They completely locked the accounts. They said the signature was a fraudulent mismatch and refused to give me a single dime. He threw the crumpled stack of legal documents directly into my face. The heavy papers scattered across the damp floor. I did not flinch. I did not cower. I looked up at my furious son, my expression completely blank and unaffected. "I do not know what you are talking about, Brandon," I said softly, playing my role with absolute perfection. "I signed exactly where you told me to sign. Is there something wrong with the money?" Brandon let out a scream of pure frustration, kicking my heavy wooden chair so hard it shattered against the wall. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest. "You are going to fix this," he threatened, his eyes wide and unhinged. "You are going to march down to that bank tomorrow morning, and you are going to personally authorize the transfer, or I swear to God, I will have you locked in the worst state asylum I can find." He turned and stormed back up the stairs, slamming the broken door behind him. I sat perfectly still in the dark, staring at the scattered papers on the floor. The trap was now fully sprung. Brandon had just attempted to commit federal bank fraud, and he had completely lost his temper doing it. The quiet game was over. It was time for my silent adjustment to completely destroy their world. Above me, the floorboards groaned violently under the weight of sheer panic. Brandon and Megan were screaming at each other in the sprawling living room. Their voices bled through the heavy wooden beams of the basement ceiling, creating a chaotic symphony of blame, fear, and desperation. Megan shrieked that Brandon was an absolute idiot for messing up the legal paperwork, her voice cracking with hysterical rage. Brandon yelled right back that he had followed her stupid plan perfectly and that the bank system was simply glitching. Gary chimed in a moment later, his booming alcohol-soaked voice demanding that someone fix the mess immediately before his aggressive creditors found out where he was hiding. I sat perfectly still in the dark, damp basement, listening to their empire of lies begin to fracture. They were completely paralyzed by the locked retirement accounts. They were so entirely distracted by the frozen funds and their own bitter infighting that they had absolutely no idea I had already packed my heavy leather briefcase. I stood up from my small wooden chair, brushing the dust from my trousers. I put on a crisp navy suit, adjusted my collar, and walked quietly out the heavy metal bulkhead door at the back of the basement. I stepped into the suffocating afternoon humidity, got into my car, and drove away from the shouting match. I merged onto the main highway, leaving the quiet suburbs behind, heading straight for the towering glass skyscrapers of downtown Atlanta. I parked in a highly secure underground garage and took the express elevator to the 42nd floor. The frosted glass double doors at the end of the long hallway bore a sharp, minimalist silver logo, Apex Real Estate Development. I walked into the freezing air conditioning of the massive corporate boardroom. My lawyer, Jonathan Hayes, was already sitting at the long mahogany table, casually nursing a cup of black coffee. Across from him sat a man in a sharp charcoal suit with eyes as cold and gray as wet concrete. His name was Marcus Vance, the Senior Acquisitions Director for Apex. Vance did not deal in cozy family homes or friendly neighborhood associations. He dealt in aggressive commercial zoning, hostile property takeovers, and rapid asset liquidation. Apex was a corporate predator, and I had specifically chosen them to execute my final strike. "You have the official bank documents?" Charles Jonathan asked, skipping the polite introductions entirely as I took a seat at the heavy table. I unlatched my briefcase and slid the thick stack of forged home equity loan papers across the polished wood. Jonathan inspected the fake signatures, a dark, predatory smile spreading across his face. He handed them directly to Vance. "As you can clearly see," Marcus Jonathan said smoothly, "the current title holder committed severe federal financial fraud against my client. This undeniable breach officially triggers Clause 7 of the original deed of trust. The property ownership reverts immediately to Charles free and clear, effective as of my legal filing with the county clerk exactly 10 minutes ago." Vance flipped through the forged documents with absolute chilling indifference. The house was easily worth over $1 million in the current Atlanta real estate market. But I had absolutely no intention of waiting 6 agonizing months for a polite, smiling family to secure a mortgage and buy it. I wanted a heavy weapon, and Apex was a tactical explosive. I had agreed to sell them the massive suburban property for $800,000 in pure, unadulterated cash. It was a steep financial discount, but I was gladly paying that premium in exchange for a brutal, immediate, and unquestionable transaction. Vance pushed a thick leather-bound contract across the mahogany table. "Sign here, here, and here," Vance instructed, handing me a heavy gold fountain pen. I stared down at the dense legal text. By signing this document, I was permanently erasing the only home my son had ever owned. I was completely wiping out the physical sanctuary I had purchased with my life savings to protect him from a harsh world. But the boy I bought that house for was long gone, entirely consumed by greed and weakness. I pressed the gold pen to the heavy paper and signed my true, accurate name, Charles Marcus Wright. The ink flowed smoothly, binding the transaction in federal stone. With 3 precise strokes of a pen, the 4-bedroom house in the suburbs ceased to be a family home. It belonged entirely to a faceless corporate entity. Vance closed the leather folder with a heavy thud and tapped his fingers against the table. "The wire transfer of $800,000 has just been initiated to your newly established secure offshore trust," Mr. Charles Vance stated flatly, checking his expensive wristwatch. "The funds will completely clear by midnight tonight. Now, regarding the current occupants of our new corporate asset, how exactly would you like us to handle the transition?" I leaned back in my leather chair, adjusting my suit cuffs. "I want the standard Apex commercial eviction protocol," I said softly. Vance nodded, a chilling corporate smile crossing his face. "We have a strict 7-day turnaround for all new residential acquisitions," he explained. "We will dispatch our private security contractors and the armed county sheriff next Monday morning at exactly 6 o'clock. They will be given exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises, or their belongings will be forcefully dragged out and thrown onto the public curb. There will be no legal extensions. There will be no judicial delays. Once the notice is taped to that door, their reign is officially over." I stood up, shook hands firmly with Jonathan and Vance, and walked back to the quiet elevator. I had almost $1 million sitting securely in an untouchable hidden account. My financial future was completely bulletproof, and my hands were entirely clean of the coming violence. I drove back to the sprawling suburban house, arriving just as the heavy sun was beginning to set over the manicured green lawns. I walked quietly through the heavy oak front door and found Brandon, Megan, Gary, and Susan all sitting around the massive kitchen island. The chaotic screaming from earlier had finally burned out, leaving behind a thick, toxic tension in the air. Empty beer bottles and crumpled paper napkins littered the expensive granite countertops. Brandon looked up as I entered, his eyes bloodshot and dark, heavy circles forming under his eyes. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded, trying desperately to project authority but sounding entirely exhausted and hollow. "I took a walk around the neighborhood to clear my head," I replied calmly, standing near the arched doorway. Megan crossed her arms defensively, glaring at me with absolute unfiltered disgust. "You are going directly to the bank with Brandon first thing tomorrow morning," she ordered, pointing a perfectly manicured finger right at my chest. "You are going to tell the branch manager that you made a stupid mistake with your signature, and you are going to unlock that retirement money immediately. If you refuse to cooperate, we will drag you to the neurology clinic by noon and have you legally committed to a state facility." I looked slowly around the beautiful, expansive kitchen. I looked at the gleaming stainless steel appliances, the custom wooden cabinets, and the 4 arrogant thieves sitting confidently on the leather bar stools. They were barking aggressive orders, completely oblivious to the massive legal earthquake that had just occurred right beneath their feet. They thought they were the kings and queens of the castle, entirely unaware that they were now legally trespassing on private corporate property. I looked directly into Megan's furious eyes and offered a slow, compliant nod. "I will be ready to go at 8 in the morning," I said quietly. I turned and walked slowly toward the basement stairs, leaving them to enjoy their stolen house, completely unaware that the countdown clock had already started ticking. The heavy wooden stairs groaned above my head less than an hour after I descended into the damp basement. The fragile truce in the kitchen had clearly shattered. Megan was pacing heavily back and forth across the hardwood floor, her sharp heels clicking like a rapid metronome of pure anxiety. The locked retirement accounts had severely bruised her massive ego, and she desperately needed a quick hit of material validation to soothe her rising panic. I stood quietly near the metal ventilation grate, listening closely as she began to berate my son once again. "Brandon," she snapped, her voice tight and demanding, "I am not waiting until tomorrow to feel like we are making progress. That idiot bank teller might have locked the pension funds, but we still have your father's platinum credit card tied to the equity line. I want the Mercedes. Right now." Brandon hesitated, his voice low and fearful as he tried to reason with her. "Megan, maybe we should just wait until the morning. We already have the truck for your dad, and making a massive purchase while the main accounts are flagged might trigger another security alert." But Megan was not a woman who ever accepted logic or delay. She slammed her hand down hard on the granite kitchen island. "Do it now, Brandon," she hissed with absolute venom. "I have been putting up with that old man living in our house, breathing our air and ruining my peace of mind. I deserve that car. Log into the dealership portal and put down the deposit before I pack my bags and leave you to deal with this entire mess completely by yourself." The threat of abandonment was the ultimate weapon against a weak-willed man like my son. I heard the familiar chime of Brandon opening his heavy laptop. Within minutes, the rapid clicking of the keyboard echoed through the floorboards. They were navigating to the website of a high-end European auto dealership located in the wealthy northern suburbs. They were brazenly typing in the 16-digit number of a credit card that legally belonged to me, utilizing the stolen equity of the house they no longer owned. "Okay. It is done." Brandon finally exhaled, sounding completely defeated. "I just authorized a $20,000 down payment on the white Mercedes SUV. The sales manager will have the keys ready for us to pick up first thing tomorrow morning before we take your dad to the bank." Megan let out a sharp, triumphant laugh. "That is more like it," she gloated. "Let the old man sleep in his damp little hole tonight. Tomorrow we drive to the bank in absolute luxury." I stepped away from the metal grate, leaving their pathetic celebration behind. The air in the basement was thick and humid, but my breathing was slow and perfectly rhythmic. They had just handed me the exact piece of leverage I needed to completely destroy their morning. I walked over to the small, cheap metal shelving unit where I had temporarily stored my life. I pulled my 2 heavy leather suitcases onto the center of the concrete floor and popped the brass latches open. It was time to execute the final phase of my physical departure. As a structural engineer, I spent my entire career designing systems that operated with absolute efficiency. When a foundational component is deemed toxic or compromised, you do not simply try to repair it. You completely extract it from the main framework, leaving an impeccably clean surgical site behind. That was exactly what I was doing to my son. I was extracting myself from his life with total irreversible precision. I began carefully folding my clothes, placing them neatly into the first leather suitcase. I did not rush. I took my time, smoothing out every single wrinkle with the palm of my hand. Then I turned my attention to the small wooden lockbox resting on my desk. Inside were the only objects in this massive house that possessed any genuine value to me. Evelyn's delicate pearl necklace, her favorite silver wristwatch, and a stack of faded Polaroid photographs from our honeymoon in Chicago. I ran my thumb over the edge of the wooden box, feeling the smooth lacquer. Evelyn had always believed that Brandon would grow up to be a strong, principled man. She poured her heart into raising him, shielding him from the harsh realities of the world. It was a bitter realization that her unconditional protection was the very thing that had made him so incredibly weak. I packed her memories safely into the second suitcase, surrounded by my heavy architectural reference books. Once the bags were zipped shut, I systematically erased all evidence of my brief stay in the cellar. I wiped down the small reading desk, sweeping away any stray dust. I stripped the thin sheets from the oak bed frame, folded them into a tight square, and placed them perfectly in the center of the bare mattress. I picked up every single piece of trash and tied off the small plastic garbage bag. When I finally stood by the door and looked back, the damp basement was entirely sterile. It looked exactly like an empty concrete tomb. It was the perfect monument to the dead relationship between a father and his greedy son. I sat on the edge of my packed suitcase in the dark, pulling my cell phone from my jacket pocket. The bright screen illuminated the harsh concrete walls around me. I dialed the 24-hour emergency fraud hotline for the Platinum credit card they had just used online. The line rang 3 times before a polite professional representative named Sarah answered. "Good evening, Mr. Charles," Sarah said warmly. "How can I assist you tonight?" I kept my voice completely calm, injecting just enough urgency to trigger their severe internal security protocols. "Sarah, I need to report a massive case of identity theft," I stated clearly. "My physical wallet was compromised and several unauthorized transactions have been made on my account over the past few weeks." Sarah immediately shifted into a strict corporate protocol. "I am so sorry to hear that, sir. Let me pull up your recent account activity. I will freeze the card immediately so no further charges can be authorized." I listened to the rapid clicking of her keyboard. As she reviewed the ledger, she suddenly gasped quietly. "Mr. Charles, I am seeing a massive pending charge of $20,000 that was initiated just 10 minutes ago to a luxury automotive dealership in the northern suburbs. Did you authorize this down payment?" "Absolutely not," I replied, my tone sharpening into cold authority. "That transaction is entirely fraudulent. The individuals who stole my identity are actively attempting to purchase a Mercedes SUV using my stolen credentials. I need you to flag that specific transaction as a federal cybercrime right now. I also need you to directly contact the Merchant Services Division of that specific dealership and inform them that the people coming to collect that vehicle tomorrow morning are using stolen financial instruments." Sarah was typing furiously now. "Consider it done, Mr. Charles," she assured me. "The $20,000 charge is officially blocked. The card is permanently deactivated. I am sending an emergency fraud alert to the dealership management right now. They will be fully prepared if anyone attempts to claim that vehicle." I thanked her and ended the call. The screen went black, plunging the basement back into shadows. I stood up, grabbing the heavy leather handles of my suitcases. I did not walk up the wooden stairs to say goodbye. I pushed open the heavy exterior bulkhead doors that led directly from the basement to the dark backyard. The humid night air washed over me as I stepped out onto the damp grass. I loaded my bags into the trunk of my car, parked quietly on the dark suburban street. Brandon and Megan were fast asleep in their stolen bedroom, dreaming of their brand new luxury car and the retirement money they planned to steal tomorrow. They had absolutely no idea that their credit was completely frozen. The dealership was waiting for them with a legal trap, and the old man they thought they controlled had just vanished into the night forever. The sleek, immaculate showroom of the luxury European auto dealership smelled strongly of expensive leather-polished wax and freshly brewed espresso. It was exactly the kind of high-end environment where Megan thrived, surrounded by the illusion of unlimited wealth. At 9 o'clock on Monday morning, she and Brandon walked through the heavy glass doors with absolute arrogance. Megan was wearing a designer silk blouse and oversized sunglasses, carrying herself like a celebrity arriving for a private viewing. Brandon trailed slightly behind her, trying his best to project the confident swagger of a successful corporate executive. They walked directly to the elevated glass desk of the senior sales manager, a sharp man in a tailored suit who had been expecting them. The gleaming white Mercedes SUV they had selected online was parked just feet away on the showroom floor, completely detailed and ready for delivery. The manager offered them sparkling water and handed Brandon the final purchase agreement. Brandon signed the documents with a flourish, eager to finally secure his wife's approval. Then he confidently slid my platinum credit card across the polished glass desk to finalize the $20,000 down payment. He expected a polite handshake and a set of keys. Instead, the manager picked up. The card glanced at the name printed on the front and looked back at his computer monitor. His polite customer service smile vanished instantly. The manager did not swipe the card. He stood up from his desk, his expression hardening into cold, uncompromising authority. He pressed a button on his desk phone, signaling the dealership security guard who was standing near the front entrance. Then he looked directly at my son. I was notified by the Federal Fraud Department less than 12 hours ago that this specific credit card was stolen, the manager announced. His voice was completely devoid of professional courtesy, and more importantly, it was incredibly loud. He did not try to keep the matter discreet. His sharp words echoed clearly across the quiet, cavernous showroom. Several wealthy customers browsing nearby stopped their conversations and turned to stare. Megan pulled her sunglasses down the bridge of her nose, her face flushing bright red with sudden embarrassment. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice trembling with indignation. "That is my father-in-law's card. My husband has full authorization to use it. There must be some kind of ridiculous mistake." The manager crossed his arms, looking down at them with absolute disgust. The primary account holder personally reported this card stolen last night and flagged this exact vehicle transaction as a federal cybercrime, he stated loudly. "I am keeping this card, and my staff has already locked the main showroom doors. I have dispatched the local police, and they are arriving right now to take your statements regarding aggravated identity theft. You are not leaving this building." The heavy silence in the showroom was broken only by the loud, humiliating whispers of the other customers watching the scene unfold. Brandon went completely pale. His corporate swagger evaporated instantly, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, sweating boy caught red-handed by the principal. He stepped back from the desk, frantically patting down his pockets until he pulled out his cell phone. Hundreds of miles away, I was driving smoothly down the interstate highway, heading deep into the Florida Panhandle. The morning sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, casting a brilliant golden glow across the dashboard of my car. The windows were cracked slightly, letting in the warm, salty air of the approaching coast. I was perfectly at peace. When my cell phone began to vibrate violently in the cup holder, I glanced down at the screen. It was Brandon. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow sip of my black coffee before I finally pressed the answer button. I did not say hello. I simply listened. "Dad," Brandon screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking with pure hysterical panic. "Dad, what did you do? We are at the dealership and they are treating us like common criminals. They confiscated the card. The manager is telling everyone in the showroom that we stole your identity and the police just pulled into the parking lot. You need to call them right now and tell them this is a massive misunderstanding. You need to tell them you authorized the down payment." In the background of the call, I could hear the faint but unmistakable sound of approaching police sirens, accompanied by Megan's shrill voice arguing aggressively with the dealership security guard. I kept my eyes focused on the open road ahead, my grip loose and relaxed on the leather steering wheel. I let a long, agonizing moment of silence pass before I finally responded. My voice was incredibly calm, flat, and completely devoid of urgency. "I do not know what you are talking about, Brandon," I said softly. "I did not report anything. The bank system must just be down again. Have you tried asking the manager to run the card a second time?" "Run it a second time!" Brandon shrieked, completely losing his mind. "They locked the doors, Dad. The police are walking inside right now. You need to fix this. Tell them you are at home. Tell them you gave me the card." "I am just sitting quietly in my basement," I replied, maintaining the perfect illusion of a confused, helpless old man. "I am just looking at the concrete walls. Maybe you should not be buying expensive cars right now, son." I ended the call and placed the phone back into the cup holder. I did not block his number yet. I wanted him to possess the desperate, lingering hope that he could still reach me, that he could still somehow manipulate his way out of the consequences. As a former engineer, I knew that the most devastating collapses happen not from a single explosive charge, but from the slow, agonizing realization that every structural support has been completely removed. I turned the radio on, listening to a classic jazz station as I continued my drive south. The physical distance between us was expanding rapidly, but the psychological distance had been infinite for a very long time. Back in Atlanta, the humiliating scene at the dealership finally reached its miserable conclusion. The police officers aggressively questioned Brandon and Megan in the center of the showroom floor, treating them like common street thieves. Because Brandon actually shared my last name and could technically argue a familial misunderstanding, the officers did not put him in handcuffs right there on the spot. However, they formally confiscated the Platinum card, recorded their identification details for the ongoing federal fraud investigation, and permanently banned them from the dealership property. They were escorted out through the front doors by armed guards in front of a dozen staring customers. They were forced to call an expensive rideshare service to take them back to the suburbs, completely humiliated, entirely broke, and vibrating with uncontrollable rage. The moment the rideshare dropped them off in our driveway, Brandon and Megan stormed into the house like a violent hurricane. Gary and Susan were sitting at the kitchen island eating breakfast, but Brandon ignored them completely. He marched straight toward the basement door, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. Megan was right behind him, screaming that I was doing this on purpose, demanding that Brandon finally drag me to the neurology clinic today to have me officially committed. Brandon grabbed the handle of the basement door and ripped it open, stomping heavily down the wooden stairs. "Dad," he roared, his voice echoing fiercely off the walls. "That is the absolute last straw. Get up right now." But there was no answer. Brandon reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped dead in his tracks. Megan bumped into his back, peering over his shoulder. The loud, aggressive insults died instantly in her throat. The damp basement was completely silent. It was bathed in cold gray light filtering through the small grated windows. The oak bed frame was completely stripped down to the bare mattress. The small wooden reading desk was entirely wiped clean of dust. My heavy leather suitcases were gone. The metal shelving unit was completely empty. There was absolutely no trace that I had ever lived down there, let alone existed in their lives. Brandon slowly walked into the center of the room, his eyes wide with sudden, terrifying realization. He looked up at the ceiling joists. The fake smoke detector with the hidden surveillance camera had been carefully unscrewed and left resting neatly in the center of the bare mattress, staring blindly up at the ceiling. They had assumed I was a senile, defeated old man trapped in their carefully constructed cage. But standing in the pristine, empty basement, the horrifying truth finally washed over them. I had not just left the house. I had meticulously planned my extraction. I had known about the camera. I had known about the credit cards. I had known about everything. And as Brandon stared at the empty room, his cell phone began to ring. It was not me calling to apologize. It was the federal branch manager of the bank calling to inform him that the frozen retirement accounts had officially been transferred to an external offshore trust, and his access was permanently revoked. The invisible noose had finally pulled tight, and I was nowhere to be found. 30,000 feet above the chaotic mess I had deliberately left behind the air in the first-class cabin was cool, crisp, and wonderfully silent. I sat by the window watching the endless blanket of white clouds roll beneath the wings of the aircraft. A polite flight attendant in a sharp navy uniform stopped by my wide leather seat offering a silver tray. I took a tall glass of sparkling water with a twist of lemon, thanking her with a genuine smile. It was the first time in over a month that someone had spoken to me with basic human decency. As I took a slow, refreshing sip, I felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the past 5 years completely lift from my shoulders. There were no damp basement smells up here. There were no hidden surveillance cameras blinking in the dark, hungry for my mistakes. There was no screaming, no manipulation, and no toxic arrogance. There was only the low, steady hum of the massive jet engines carrying me toward my new life on the Florida Gulf Coast. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to fully embrace the absolute peace of my calculated victory. I knew exactly what was happening back in Atlanta. I could perfectly envision Brandon and Megan tearing that empty basement apart, desperately searching for a clue, a note, or any trace of the retirement money they had so eagerly tried to steal. They were currently trapped in a house of cards that was already collapsing around them, completely paralyzed by the locked federal accounts. But their frantic panic was no longer my problem. I had officially severed the rotting branch from my family tree. I had spent my entire adult life building safety nets for a son who only wanted to use the rope to hang me. Now the safety net was gone. I finished my sparkling water and handed the empty glass back to the flight attendant. I leaned my seat back, stretching my legs out fully. For the first time since my beautiful wife Evelyn passed away, I felt truly and completely free. The emotional bleeding had finally stopped. I was not a victim fleeing in the night. I was a retired chief engineer who had successfully isolated a critical systemic failure and permanently neutralized the threat. The heavy commercial jet touched down smoothly on the sun-baked Florida runway. As I stepped out of the air-conditioned terminal and into the bright afternoon, the warm, salty breeze off the Gulf of Mexico instantly hit my face. It smelled like freedom and open horizons. I did not waste a single second looking back. I hailed a premium car service and directed the driver to take me straight to the coastal real estate office I had contacted a few days prior. I had spent 40 years of my life working in loud, grimy industrial shipping yards, always promising Evelyn that one day we would retire to a quiet porch by the water. I had put that dream entirely on hold to buy the Atlanta house for Brandon. Now I was finally keeping that promise to her and to myself. The local real estate agent, a sharp professional woman, was waiting for me with the keys to a spectacular beachfront property. We drove down a quiet palm tree-lined street and pulled into the driveway of a beautiful, elevated wooden house. It had a massive wraparound porch facing the ocean, completely unobstructed views of the crashing waves, and a private wooden walkway leading directly down to the white sand. It was breathtaking. It was the exact opposite of a dark, damp, concrete basement. We stood in the bright, airy kitchen with the windows wide open, listening to the soothing rhythm of the tide. The agent handed me the thick purchase contract, apologizing profusely for the standard bank delays that usually accompanied such a large transaction. I smiled politely, pulled my laptop from my heavy leather briefcase, and logged into my secure offshore trust. I did not need a mortgage. I did not need a 30-day escrow period. I executed a direct verified wire transfer for the full asking price. $800,000 in pure, untraceable cash cleared the banking system and landed in the agency account before we even finished touring the master bedroom. The agent was absolutely speechless. She handed me the heavy brass keys right there on the spot. I walked out onto my new wooden porch, leaned against the sturdy railing, and took a deep breath of the ocean air. The house was officially mine, completely free and clear of any debt forgery or greedy relatives. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles north in the suffocating suburban humidity of Atlanta, the weekend of frantic paranoia had finally come to a brutal end. It was exactly 6 o'clock on Monday morning. The massive house was dead silent. Brandon, Megan, Gary, and Susan were all fast asleep in their stolen bedrooms, completely exhausted from 2 straight days of bitter arguments and terrified speculation about my sudden disappearance. They had spent the entire weekend trying and failing to bypass the federal lock on my retirement accounts, completely unaware that a much larger fatal blow had already been struck against them. Suddenly, a violent rhythmic banging shattered the early morning silence. It was not a polite knock. It was the heavy, authoritative pounding of a solid metal flashlight striking the thick oak of the front door. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the sprawling living room, vibrating violently up the grand staircase. In the master bedroom, Brandon jolted awake, his heart hammering against his ribs. He rubbed his bloodshot eyes, throwing off the expensive silk sheets. He looked at Megan, who was sitting up in bed, clutching the blankets with a look of sudden, desperate hope. "It has to be him," Megan whispered frantically. "Your father finally came back. He must have realized he has nowhere else to go." Brandon felt a massive surge of arrogant relief wash over him. He quickly threw on a robe and marched heavily down the wooden stairs, fully prepared to unleash a torrent of verbal abuse. He was going to drag me inside, lock the doors, and force me to march to the bank to fix his mess. He reached the heavy oak door, unlatched the deadbolt, and swung it open with an angry sneer on his face. But the sneer vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, paralyzing dread. I was not standing on the front porch. Instead, Brandon found himself staring directly into the stern, uncompromising faces of 2 fully uniformed county sheriff deputies. Their hands rested casually but deliberately near their duty belts. Standing just behind the armed officers was a tall, imposing man in a sharp corporate suit holding a thick metal clipboard. It was the senior acquisitions agent from Apex Real Estate Development. Brandon gripped the edge of the doorframe, the color completely draining from his face as the early morning heat hit him. "Can I help you, officers?" Brandon stammered, his voice cracking with sudden terror. The lead sheriff stepped forward, completely ignoring the pleasantries. He held up a thick court-stamped document wrapped in a clear plastic sleeve. "We are executing a mandatory commercial eviction notice on behalf of the Apex Corporation," the sheriff announced, his voice loud enough to wake Gary and Susan sleeping upstairs. "The ownership of this property was legally transferred and recorded last week. You and all other unauthorized occupants have exactly 24 hours to permanently vacate these premises. If any individuals or personal belongings remain on this property by 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, you will be physically removed and arrested for criminal trespassing. Brandon could not breathe. He stared blindly at the official seal on the paper, the reality of the shadow transfer finally crashing down upon him with the force of a falling building. The house was gone, the money was gone, and the hammer had just dropped. Gary stomped heavily down the hardwood stairs, his face flushed red with sleep and irritation. Megan was right behind him, clutching her silk robe tightly against her chest. "What the hell is going on down here?" Gary bellowed, completely oblivious to the heavy silver badge and the duty weapon resting on the officer's hip. He shoved past Brandon, who was still standing entirely frozen in the doorway. "You people have absolutely no right to be banging on my door at this ungodly hour. I know my rights, and I will have your badges for harassment." The lead sheriff did not even blink at the aggressive outburst. He had dealt with hundreds of loud, entitled squatters in his long career. He simply stepped sideways, allowing the tall, imposing corporate representative from Apex Real Estate Development to step directly onto the front porch. The Apex agent did not look angry. He looked entirely bored, which made the situation infinitely more terrifying. He held up a thick, court-stamped document and pressed it firmly against Gary's chest, forcing the older man to instinctively grab it before it fell. "That is a 24-hour mandatory notice to vacate the Apex agent," said his voice as cold as absolute zero. "This property was legally acquired by our corporate holding company late last week in a direct cash transaction. We do not rent to residential tenants. We do not offer grace periods. If you, your daughter, your son-in-law, and every single piece of your cheap furniture are not completely off this physical plot of land by tomorrow morning at exactly 6 o'clock, the sheriff will return with a specialized extraction team." Gary stared at the paper, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Megan let out a sharp, hysterical shriek, pushing her way to the front of the doorway. "You are completely insane," she screamed, pointing her finger right at the agent's face. "My husband owns this house. His name is right on the deed. We are not going anywhere. You cannot just come here and steal our property." The lead sheriff let out a heavy, tired sigh. He reached into his leather duty bag and pulled out a certified copy of the new property deed adorned with the official blue ink seal of the county clerk. He held it up so Megan and Gary could clearly see the dense legal text, though he deliberately kept it out of their grabbing reach. "Ma'am," the sheriff stated firmly, "your husband does not own anything. The previous primary grantor, Charles Marcus Wright, executed a legal revocation of the title due to severe financial fraud. The property was immediately sold to Apex. You are currently standing on private corporate ground, and you are officially trespassing." The words hit Brandon like a physical blow to the stomach. The air was completely sucked out of his lungs. Financial fraud. The realization crashed down upon him with devastating, humiliating clarity. The home equity line of credit. The $250,000 he had stolen to pay off Gary's gambling debts and buy Megan's luxury cars. He had forged my signature thinking he was incredibly smart, completely unaware that he had just triggered a hidden legal trapdoor I had planted 5 years ago. I had not just abandoned the house, I had weaponized it. By committing federal wire fraud to secure the loan, Brandon had legally forfeited his own right to the property under Clause 7 of our original contract. He had literally signed away his own home. Gary turned to Brandon, his face turning purple with absolute fury. "What the hell did you do?" Gary roared, grabbing Brandon roughly by the collar of his robe and shaking him violently. "You told us this place was yours. You told us we were totally secure." Brandon could not speak. His knees buckled slightly, his mind spinning wildly out of control. Megan began to hyperventilate, stepping back from the door as the reality of their absolute poverty finally set in. They had no savings, they had no backup plan, they had thrown all of their stolen money into expensive clothes, lavish parties, and a luxury vehicle they were permanently banned from driving. The Apex agent tapped his heavy metal clipboard against the doorframe, breaking the chaotic silence. 24 hours, gentlemen," he reminded them coldly. "I highly suggest you start packing your bags instead of arguing." The sheriff turned around, walking back down the concrete path toward his marked cruiser, completely ignoring the bitter screaming match that had just erupted inside the foyer. The heavy oak door slammed shut, plunging the house into a state of absolute unhinged panic. The fake suburban royalty was completely stripped of their stolen crowns. Susan ran downstairs crying hysterically as Megan began throwing expensive vases and picture frames against the living room wall in a blind, destructive rage. Gary was pacing the kitchen floor like a caged animal, screaming that he was not going back to a cheap trailer park. He demanded that Brandon fix the situation immediately, threatening to physically beat him if he did not produce a miracle. But Brandon was completely paralyzed. He stumbled away from his screaming in-laws, retreating into the empty dining room. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold his cell phone. He unlocked the screen and frantically dialed my number. It rang completely through to voicemail. He dialed it again and again and again. He paced back and forth across the expensive hardwood floors, tears of pure terror streaming down his face, leaving dozens of frantic, sobbing voicemails begging for mercy, begging for money, begging for me to make the bad men go away. He called me exactly 50 times in the span of 30 minutes. Hundreds of miles away, the morning sun was climbing high over the sparkling blue waters of the Gulf of Mexico. I was sitting comfortably in a heavy wooden rocking chair on my new beachfront porch, wearing a light linen shirt and enjoying the warm, salty breeze. A fresh cup of premium dark roast coffee rested on the small glass table beside me. Next to the coffee mug, my cell phone was vibrating continuously, lighting up the table with Brandon's name over and over again. I did not mute the phone. I did not turn it off. I simply sat back, took a slow, satisfying sip of my coffee, and watched the screen light up with his absolute desperation. I listened to the ocean waves crashing rhythmically against the shore, perfectly in tune with the complete destruction of the toxic world I had left behind. They had 24 hours to pack their miserable lives into garbage bags and walk out the front door with absolutely nothing. But as I watched the pelicans dive into the clear water, I knew the eviction was only the first wave of their punishment. They were so entirely consumed by losing the house that they had completely forgotten about the massive fraudulent loan they had taken out against it. When the bank discovered their collateral had just been legally sold to a commercial developer, the financial system was going to demand their $250,000 back immediately. The trap was about to snap shut a second time, and the federal authorities were already sharpening their teeth. I sat peacefully on my Florida porch, listening to the gentle rhythm of the ocean waves, knowing exactly what was happening inside the massive air-conditioned servers of the First National Bank in downtown Atlanta. I did not need to be in the room to understand the precise mechanical sequence of their financial security systems. When Apex Real Estate Development legally filed the new property deed with the county clerk, a digital tripwire was instantly triggered deep within the bank's mainframe. The automated risk assessment software constantly scans municipal registries to protect their highly valuable collateral. Just before noon, a glaring red alert flashed across the monitors of the senior underwriting department. The massive 4-bedroom suburban house, the sole physical collateral securing Brandon's fraudulent $250,000 home equity line of credit, had completely vanished from his legal possession. It now belonged to a heavily fortified, billion-dollar corporate entity. A loan of that massive magnitude without any physical collateral is an absolute nightmare for a financial institution. The senior loan officer did not hesitate or wait for an explanation. He immediately authorized a severe margin call. It was a strict, uncompromising legal demand for the absolute and total repayment of the entire $250,000 balance within 48 hours under threat of immediate asset seizure and federal prosecution. Back at the house, amidst the chaotic screaming and the terrifying reality of the eviction notice, Brandon felt his cell phone vibrate heavily in his pocket. He pulled it out with shaking, sweaty hands, expecting another angry, demanding text from Gary. Instead, he saw a priority email from the bank's executive branch. He opened the message, his bloodshot eyes scanning the dense, aggressive financial terminology. The bank was demanding $250,000 in liquid cash. Money he absolutely did not have. Money he had recklessly thrown away on luxury European cars and offshore gambling debts. His knees finally gave out. He collapsed onto the expensive hardwood floor of the foyer, the phone slipping from his fingers and clattering against the wood. He was no longer just a man losing his home. He was a man facing total catastrophic financial ruin, staring into an abyss he had dug with his own 2 hands. But the devastating margin call was only the first automated layer of the bank's aggressive defense mechanism. Once a high-value loan is flagged for missing collateral, the Internal Compliance Division immediately initiates a deep forensic audit. I knew the exact procedures because I had spent decades securing my own wealth through those very same institutions. A team of senior fraud investigators was quickly assembled in a secure downtown boardroom overlooking the city skyline. They pulled the original physical paperwork for the home equity loan from their fireproof vault and laid it out on a polished glass table. They pulled my extensive 40-year financial profile to meticulously cross-reference the data. The discrepancy was glaringly obvious to the highly trained eyes of the federal compliance officers. They analyzed the signature on the loan application. It was a clumsy, desperate fake lacking the precise mechanical control of an engineer's handwriting. They pulled the digital IP logs of the online transfers, tracing the massive withdrawals directly to Brandon's personal laptop. Then the system algorithm highlighted the secondary, undeniable anomaly. It flagged the recent failed attempt to authorize a comprehensive medical and financial power of attorney. The investigators noted the deliberately incorrect middle initial I had used to sabotage the document right in front of the hidden basement camera. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying, undeniable clarity. The compliance director stared at the thick file, realizing this was not simply a case of a delinquent borrower defaulting on a standard loan. It was a highly coordinated $250,000 identity theft committed against an elderly account holder. Brandon had actively hijacked my financial identity, forged legal federal documents, likely bribed a cheap notary public, and systematically drained the funds. The sheer scale of the deception elevated the situation from a minor civil dispute to a major criminal conspiracy. The bank immediately locked every single credit card, checking account, and savings portfolio tied to Brandon and Megan, freezing their remaining loose change. They were completely severed from the financial grid, left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs and a massive mountain of fraudulent debt. Because the stolen funds involved a federally insured institution, and the money had been electronically wired across state lines to satisfy Gary's shady offshore gambling syndicate. The compliance director was legally mandated to escalate the situation immediately. He did not bother calling the local suburban police department. He forwarded the complete forensic audit, the forged signatures, and the digital IP logs directly to the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The federal authorities do not operate with the slow bureaucratic delays of local civil courts. When $250,000 in wire fraud and identity theft is clearly documented and handed to them on a silver platter, they move with absolute devastating speed. Back at the sprawling suburban house, the scene had devolved into pure, unadulterated madness. The elegant illusion of their wealthy suburban lifestyle had completely shattered into a million sharp pieces. Megan was sobbing hysterically on the floor of the master bedroom, frantically stuffing her expensive designer dresses, luxury handbags, and expensive shoes into cheap black plastic garbage bags. Gary and Susan were tearing through the guest rooms, hoarding whatever small valuables they could find, acting like terrified rats abandoning a sinking ship. They were screaming bitter insults at each other, the toxic family loyalty completely dissolving in the face of absolute poverty. Gary blamed Brandon for being an incompetent idiot, while Megan blamed her parents for leeching off them in the first place. Brandon was still sitting paralyzed on the floor of the foyer, staring blankly at the wall, unable to process the sheer magnitude of his failure. They were so entirely consumed by the panic of the 24-hour eviction deadline and their vicious infighting that they did not notice the heavy tires crunching aggressively onto the manicured gravel driveway. It was not a moving truck coming to help them transport their stolen goods. 3 unmarked, heavily tinted black sport utility vehicles aggressively blocked the perimeter of the property, cutting off any chance of escape. The heavy doors swung open in perfect unison. Men and women wearing dark tactical vests with bright yellow letters printed across their backs stepped out onto the green lawn. FBI. They did not ring the decorative doorbell. They did not wait for a polite invitation from the homeowner. They pounded on the heavy oak door with an absolute authority that shook the very foundation of the stolen house. Brandon slowly turned his head toward the deafening sound, the last remaining shred of his arrogant pride evaporating into thin air. The silent adjustment was finally complete. The heavy hammer of federal justice had arrived, and there was nowhere left to hide. I was not physically standing on the manicured lawn of the Atlanta house when the federal agents breached the front door, but the detailed police reports and the comprehensive updates from my attorney painted a remarkably vivid picture. When Brandon slowly opened the heavy oak door, he was instantly met by the blinding glare of tactical flashlights and the uncompromising authority of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The lead agent did not ask for permission to enter. He stepped directly into the grand foyer, holding up a federal warrant for aggravated identity theft and wire fraud. Gary, Susan, and Megan stumbled out of the living room, their chaotic packing instantly halted by the presence of armed federal officers. The agent in charge loudly announced the exact nature of the charges, detailing the fraudulent $250,000 home equity line of credit and the forged guarantor signature. The words hung in the humid morning air like a death sentence. Gary stood frozen near the expensive granite kitchen island, his bloodshot eyes widening as the terrifying reality of his situation set in. He realized in that exact moment that the massive sum of money Brandon had used to pay off his dangerous offshore gambling debts was completely stolen from a federally insured bank. Gary knew the federal government would mercilessly track every single stolen dollar, meaning his own illegal betting syndicates would be heavily scrutinized and he would be held criminally liable as a direct beneficiary of the fraud. The false illusion of Brandon being a wealthy, successful corporate executive shattered into a million jagged pieces. Gary did not look at his son-in-law with pity or concern. He looked at him with the pure, unadulterated hatred of a cornered animal. With a loud guttural roar, Gary lunged across the foyer. He swung his heavy, calloused fist with absolute maximum force, striking Brandon directly in the center of his face. The sickening crunch of breaking cartilage echoed through the house. "You scammed us!" Gary screamed, spit flying from his lips as Brandon collapsed backward through the open doorway and tumbled onto the front porch. "You stupid, arrogant little boy. You ruined my life." Brandon hit the hard concrete of the porch and rolled down the short flight of brick stairs, landing heavily on the perfectly manicured green lawn. Blood poured freely from his shattered nose, soaking into the collar of his expensive silk robe. He gasped for air, his hands clutching his face in absolute agony. The federal agents immediately sprang into action, tackling Gary to the floor of the foyer and violently twisting his arms behind his back to secure him in heavy steel handcuffs. Susan shrieked hysterically, backing into the kitchen counter as the officers aggressively pinned her husband down. Brandon lay on the damp grass, shivering from the shock and the sudden, overwhelming physical pain. He rolled onto his side and looked up at the front door, desperately seeking a lifeline. He looked directly at his wife. Megan was standing on the porch, staring down at her bleeding husband surrounded by federal agents. But there was absolutely no love or concern in her eyes. There was only a cold, calculating instinct for sheer survival. I always knew Megan was a parasite who only attached herself to a host for financial security. And now that the host was completely poisoned with federal debt and facing years in a federal penitentiary, her loyalty evaporated instantly. She did not run down the stairs to comfort him. She did not ask the agents for a towel to stop his bleeding. Instead, Megan took a deliberate step backward, physically distancing herself from the wreckage. "I had absolutely nothing to do with this," Megan screamed, her voice piercing the chaotic morning air. Her hands were raised defensively, playing the role of the innocent, victimized wife for the federal agents. "I never signed any of those bank documents. He lied to me. He told me he was using his own corporate bonus money. I want a divorce, Brandon. Do you hear me? I am filing for divorce today. I will not let you drag me down into federal prison because you are a pathetic, lying failure." She completely abandoned him right there on the wet grass, throwing him entirely to the wolves to save her own skin. Hours later, the sun began to set over the beautiful, calm waters of the Florida Gulf Coast. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and deep purple. I was sitting on my heavy wooden porch swing, watching the tide slowly roll back into the ocean. The air was incredibly peaceful. My cell phone sat silently on the small table next to my chair. It had stopped vibrating hours ago, right around the time the federal agents had officially confiscated Brandon's personal belongings for evidence. Hundreds of miles away, in a cold, sterile federal processing center in downtown Atlanta, my son was experiencing a completely different kind of evening. According to the standard booking procedures, Brandon had been stripped of his expensive clothes, forced into a harsh orange jumpsuit, and locked inside a damp concrete holding cell. His nose had been hastily bandaged by a jail nurse, throbbing with a dull, relentless pain. He was entirely alone. Megan had followed through on her threat, refusing to answer calls from his court-appointed public defender. Gary was locked in a different cell block, likely plotting how to murder him the second they crossed paths in the yard. Brandon had hit absolute rock bottom. The heavy steel door of his cell opened with a loud clank, and a guard escorted him to a wall-mounted metal telephone for his one legally mandated phone call. Brandon picked up the heavy plastic receiver with a trembling, bruised hand. He did not dial his wife. He did not dial his corporate friends who had gladly drank his stolen champagne just a few days prior. He dialed the only number he had ever relied on when he was in trouble. He dialed his father. On my porch, the cell phone suddenly lit up, breaking the quiet evening silence. I looked at the screen. It was an automated caller identification from the Fulton County Federal Detention Center. I let it ring twice. The rhythmic sound of the ocean waves provided the perfect background music for this exact moment. I reached out, picked up the phone, and pressed the green answer button. I did not say a word. I simply held the phone to my ear and waited. Dad Brandon choked out his voice, a pathetic broken whisper echoing through the static of the jailhouse phone line. Dad, please. Please tell me you are there. Please do not hang up. I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for everything. They took the house. They took the money. Gary broke my nose, and Megan left me. I am sitting in a federal cell, Dad. They are charging me with severe wire fraud. They are talking about a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence. You have to call your lawyer. You have to tell them you permitted the loan. Please, Dad, you are the only one who can save me. I listened to his desperate sobbing pleas. I listened to the terrified boy who had so eagerly conspired to lock me away in a mental asylum just to steal my retirement funds. I took a slow, deep breath of the warm coastal air. My voice, when I finally spoke, was as smooth and cold as a sheet of solid winter ice. I listened to the heavy, ragged breathing coming through the receiver. Brandon was weeping with the kind of absolute, unrestrained terror that only comes when a man realizes his entire life is permanently over. Dad, please say something. Brandon begged, his voice echoing off the hard concrete walls of his holding cell. You have to tell them it was a massive misunderstanding. Tell the federal agents that you gave me permission to sign the home equity documents. Tell them you authorized the loan because my hands were full, or because you were feeling tired that day and asked me to handle the paperwork. If you just call your lawyer and make an official statement, they will drop the wire fraud charges. I will pay back every single penny to the bank. I swear to God, I will work 3 jobs and pay it all back. Just do not let them send me to federal prison. The sheer audacity of his request was almost fascinating to listen to. Even now, sitting in a harsh orange jumpsuit with a broken nose, completely abandoned by the wife he had committed treason, for his first instinct was to manipulate me. He was not apologizing for stealing my identity or trying to lock me in a psychiatric ward. He was only apologizing because he had been caught by a massive federal entity he could not bully, evict, or outsmart. He genuinely wanted me to commit federal perjury, to risk my own freedom and my own immaculate reputation just to save him from the crushing consequences of his own boundless greed. I took a slow sip of my dark roast coffee, letting the warm liquid coat my throat. The salty breeze coming off the Gulf of Mexico rustled the palm leaves in my front yard, providing a peaceful, rhythmic soundtrack to his pathetic unraveling. I did not feel a single ounce of paternal pity. The boy I had raised had died the exact moment he pointed me toward that damp basement. The terrified man sobbing on the other end of the phone was simply a defective component that had been successfully identified and permanently removed from my life. When I finally spoke, my voice was completely empty of anger, sorrow, or sympathy. It was as cold and hard as the steel bars currently keeping him locked in a cage. You remember the basement, Brandon? I asked quietly. My words cut through his hysterical sobbing like a precision surgical scalpel. I heard him gasp, his breath catching painfully in his throat as the memory hit him. You remember the damp concrete floor, the smell of mildew, and the little fake smoke detector you and your wife mounted directly above my desk. You spent weeks actively trying to convince me and the rest of the world that I was rapidly losing my mind. You desperately tried to build a fraudulent legal case that my brain was rotting just so you could steal my private pension and lock me away in a miserable state facility while you drank expensive champagne in my house. Brandon tried to interrupt, stammering out a desperate denial about Megan forcing him to do it, but I did not let him speak. I am not losing my memory, Brandon. I continued, my tone perfectly even and relentlessly sharp. My mind is absolutely flawless. I remember exactly who banished me from my own bedroom. I remember exactly who forged my name on those federal bank documents. And I remember exactly how it felt to watch my only son throw my life away for a parasitical woman who completely abandoned him the absolute second the stolen money ran dry. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the phone line. The only sound was the faint hum of the jailhouse ventilation system on his end and the crashing ocean waves on mine. Brandon finally understood the magnitude of his fatal error. He realized that this was not a minor family dispute he could win with fake tears or empty promises of repayment. He was not talking to a soft, forgiving father anymore. He was talking to the architect of his total destruction. I had given him the rope, but he had eagerly tied the knot and placed it firmly around his own neck. "But Dad, I am your son," Brandon whispered, his voice completely broken and devoid of any remaining pride. "You cannot just leave me here to rot. They are going to lock me away for a decade." I pressed the red button on my cell phone screen, instantly terminating the call. I did not say goodbye. I did not offer any final words of wisdom, forgiveness, or closure. I simply severed the connection, cutting him off in the middle of his pathetic, desperate plea. I opened the contact settings on my phone, selected his profile, and permanently blocked the number. I placed the device face down on the glass table next to my coffee mug and leaned back in my heavy wooden rocking chair. The physical conflict was officially over. There would be no more aggressive shouting matches in the suburbs, no more hidden surveillance cameras, and no more forged legal documents. The turbulent, violent chapter of my life in Atlanta was completely and permanently closed. But for Brandon, the true nightmare was only just beginning. By handing the forged loan documents directly to the federal authorities, I had removed the situation entirely from the realm of emotional family drama and placed it squarely into the grinding, merciless gears of the federal justice system. The FBI does not care about tearful apologies. Federal prosecutors do not care about broken noses, manipulative wives, or demanding in-laws. They only care about paper trails, IP addresses, financial ledgers, and felony convictions. In the coming weeks, Brandon would face a federal grand jury. He would be formally indicted for aggravated identity theft, bank fraud, and federal wire fraud. Without a single dollar to his name and abandoned by his incredibly selfish wife, he would be completely at the mercy of an overworked public defender. Gary would face his own massive legal battles as the federal agents tore into his illegal offshore gambling syndicates. Megan would try to run, but the crushing debt of the margin call would legally follow her through the divorce proceedings, completely destroying her credit and her fake affluent lifestyle forever. They would all be forced to accept harsh realities, trading their stolen youth and arrogant entitlement for concrete cells and absolute poverty. I watched the bright sun finally dip below the horizon, painting the ocean water in deep, magnificent shades of twilight. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the clean coastal air. The silent adjustment had successfully restored the natural order of the universe. I had protected my hard-earned legacy, secured my ultimate peace, and ensured that the ultimate price for absolute betrayal was paid in full. The legal machinery was now running entirely on its own, and I had a beautiful beachfront retirement to enjoy. 3 months later, the oppressive, humid heat of the Atlanta summer had finally given way to a crisp autumn chill. I sat quietly in the second row of the federal courthouse, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, watching the final act of their destruction unfold. The courtroom was vast, intimidating, and entirely stripped of any warmth. The high mahogany walls and the heavy seal of the federal government hanging above the judge's bench demanded absolute respect, a concept my family had never bothered to learn. The federal prosecutor had formally charged Brandon and Megan with conspiracy to commit wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Gary was facing his own separate federal indictments for illegal gambling syndicates and money laundering. But today, the spotlight was entirely on Megan. She had aggressively pushed her defense attorney to separate her trial from Brandon's, desperately attempting to save herself by throwing her husband completely under the bus. Megan took the witness stand, raising her right hand and swearing to tell the whole truth. She had abandoned her expensive designer dresses for a cheap conservative gray blouse. Her hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail, and she held a crumpled tissue in her trembling hands. She looked exactly like a terrified, innocent suburban housewife who had been horribly deceived by a monster. It was a brilliant, calculated performance. For over an hour, she cried heavy theatrical tears. She told the federal judge and the jury that Brandon was a secretive, financially abusive husband who completely controlled every single aspect of their household income. She swore under oath that she had absolutely no idea the $250,000 home equity line of credit even existed. She claimed she thought the money used to buy her luxury Mercedes and fund her lavish housewarming barbecue came entirely from his corporate bonuses. She looked directly at the jury box, her voice breaking perfectly, and stated that she would never have allowed her beloved father-in-law to be forced into a damp basement if she had known the terrible truth. Sitting at the defense table, Brandon looked completely hollowed out. His face was pale, his shoulders were slumped, and he stared at the woman he had committed federal treason for with absolute disbelief. She was lying through her teeth, committing blatant perjury in a federal courtroom, and she was doing it flawlessly. But Megan had completely forgotten about the architect of her downfall. She had forgotten that an engineer never leaves a structural flaw undocumented. When the defense rested, the judge allowed my attorney, Jonathan Hayes, to approach the podium as a special representative of the victim. Jonathan did not look angry or aggressive. He looked like a predator who had just cornered a wounded rabbit. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked directly at Megan. Mrs. Wright Jonathan began, his voice smooth and echoing loudly across the quiet courtroom. You have just testified under the penalty of federal perjury that you had absolutely zero knowledge of the fraudulent loan and that you believed the money came entirely from legitimate corporate bonuses. Is that your final sworn statement? Megan gripped her tissue tightly, lifting her chin with fake defensive courage. Yes, she answered softly. I knew nothing about his crimes. Jonathan nodded slowly. He turned to the judge and officially requested permission to submit a digital audio file into federal evidence, recorded legally in a single-party consent state. The judge granted the motion. Jonathan picked up a small remote control from his desk and pressed play. The crisp, undeniable sound of Megan's voice suddenly filled the massive courtroom. It was a recording I had secretly captured on my cell phone while standing over the hot charcoal grill during their lavish backyard barbecue 3 months prior. I had slipped the phone into my apron pocket right as Megan walked over to grab a drink with her affluent friends. The audio was crystal clear. It was Megan laughing loudly over the sound of the patio music. Oh my God, Jessica, you have no idea how easy it was, the recorded voice of Megan boasted proudly. The old man is completely clueless. Brandon just traced his signature on the bank documents and they wired us $250,000 in pure equity. We bought the cars we paid off my dad, and the best part is the old fool is living in the basement and paying for all of it. He has absolutely no idea we drained the house. The digital recording clicked off. The absolute deafening silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. The fake innocent tears on Megan's face dried instantly. All the color completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. Her defense attorney put his head in his hands, knowing his client had just committed federal perjury in front of the judge. Brandon let out a loud, bitter laugh from the defense table, finally seeing the true, hideous face of the woman he had ruined his life for. I sat in the gallery, my expression completely blank, my hands resting calmly on my lap. The lie was dead. The truth was standing right in the center of the room, naked and undeniable. The federal judge leaned forward over his high mahogany bench. His face was entirely devoid of mercy. His eyes burned with a furious, righteous anger. He looked down at Megan with absolute disgust. Mrs. Wright, the judge said, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying growl. I have presided over this court for 2 decades. I have seen thieves, I have seen liars, and I have seen cowards. But the sheer, unadulterated arrogance you have displayed in my courtroom today is entirely unprecedented. You did not just actively conspire to steal $250,000 from an elderly man. You attempted to manipulate the federal justice system by committing blatant documented perjury right to my face. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel. There would be no leniency. There would be no suspended sentences for good behavior. The court finds both defendants unequivocally guilty on all federal charges of wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy, the judge declared loudly. He did not sentence them to a decade in a federal penitentiary. He did something much worse. He sentenced them to a lifetime of inescapable poverty and humiliation. The judge ordered complete and immediate financial restitution to the federal banking institution. Every single stolen dollar had to be repaid with aggressive federal interest attached. Because they were both convicted of severe financial felonies, their permanent criminal records would make it absolutely impossible for either of them to ever secure a corporate job, sign a standard lease, or obtain a line of credit for the rest of their natural lives. Furthermore, the judge ordered 5,000 hours of mandatory strict community service for both of them, specifically assigning them to the most grueling, degrading manual labor the county had to offer. You wanted to live like wealthy elites on stolen money, the judge sneered, raising his gavel high into the air. Now you will spend the next 10 years of your miserable lives cleaning the filth off the public highways you used to drive your luxury cars on. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down onto the sounding block with a massive echoing crack. The sound signaled the absolute end of their privileged existence. Federal marshals stepped forward immediately, placing heavy steel handcuffs onto Megan's wrists right there in the witness box. She finally started crying real tears, sobbing uncontrollably as the cold metal locked into place. Brandon stood up slowly, putting his hands behind his back, his spirit completely and totally broken. I did not stay to watch them get marched out through the side doors. I had seen everything I needed to see. I stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored suit, and quietly walked out of the heavy mahogany doors. I stepped out into the crisp autumn air of downtown Atlanta, hailed a premium car service, and headed straight for the airport. My flight back to the warm, peaceful beaches of the Florida Gulf Coast was waiting. The legal slaughter was over. Now, they simply had to survive the punishment of their own poverty. The reality of a federal restitution order is absolute and uncompromising. The government does not care about your comfort, your former zip code, or your delicate sensibilities. With their bank accounts completely drained by federal authorities and their wages heavily garnished, the fake suburban royalty was violently shoved to the absolute bottom of the socio-economic ladder. Megan, Gary, and Susan were forced to rent a decaying aluminum-sided mobile home in a notorious trailer park on the far outskirts of the county. The sprawling green lawns and the custom interior design of my Atlanta house were replaced by cracked linoleum floors, a leaking roof, and the constant deafening roar of the nearby interstate highway. Megan, who had once thrown lavish catered barbecues and bragged to her affluent friends about her custom nursery wallpaper, was now required to spend her weekends wearing a bright orange safety vest. She spent her days picking up heavy bags of rotting trash along that exact same highway to satisfy her 5,000 hours of mandatory community service. Her expensive designer clothes had been sold to local pawn shops months ago just to keep the electricity running in the sweltering trailer. The final crushing blow for her arrogant parents came on a blistering Tuesday afternoon. The massive, heavy-duty diesel truck Gary had aggressively ordered me to wash in my own driveway was not immune to the financial collapse. Because the vehicle was partially purchased with the fraudulent bank funds, it was legally subjected to federal seizure. Gary was standing on the dirt patch in front of their trailer drinking a cheap domestic beer when the heavy commercial tow truck arrived. He screamed, he cursed, and he threw his empty glass bottle at the repo man, but it was entirely useless. He was forced to watch in humiliated silence as the rusted metal hooks attached to the front axle and dragged his last remaining symbol of false pride out of the dirt lot. They were completely trapped in a prison of their own making, suffocating in the humid Georgia heat without a single dollar to their names, constantly blaming each other for their total destruction. Brandon was experiencing a very different, deeply isolating kind of hell. Because of his severe federal felony convictions for wire fraud and identity theft, his promising career as a corporate logistics manager was permanently obliterated. No respectable firm would ever hire a man who had actively stolen $250,000 from his own family. The court mandate required him to maintain steady employment to pay back his massive financial restitution, leaving him with absolutely zero options in the professional world. The man who used to wear expensive tailored suits and drive luxury European sedans was now wearing a stiff, cheap polyester uniform. He was working the graveyard shift at a decaying 24-hour gas station on the absolute worst side of the city. My lawyer Jonathan took immense pleasure in sending me the quarterly employment updates required by the court, detailing exactly where my son spent his miserable nights. Brandon spent his shifts standing behind a thick sheet of scratched bulletproof glass under the harsh, buzzing glare of fluorescent lights. He mopped the sticky floors, cleaned the filthy public restrooms, and endured the constant verbal abuse of drunk customers who stumbled in at 3 a.m. The ultimate humiliation occurred when former corporate colleagues would occasionally stop for gas, recognizing the disgraced executive wiping down the hot dog roller. Every 2 weeks, Brandon received a minimum wage paycheck that was instantly decimated by the federal government. They took exactly 75% of his meager earnings to pay back the stolen home equity funds, leaving him with barely enough money to buy cheap canned food and rent a tiny windowless room in a dangerous boarding house. He was completely divorced from Megan, entirely cut off from his former wealthy friends, and utterly alone in a cold city. The sheer physical exhaustion of the graveyard shift was nothing compared to the psychological torture of knowing he had thrown away a guaranteed prosperous future for absolutely nothing. It was during one of those endless, agonizing night shifts that Brandon finally broke completely. The heavy winter rain was slamming violently against the glass windows of the gas station, and the store was completely empty. He sat on a plastic milk crate behind the cash register, his hands trembling with exhaustion and cold. He looked at the harsh fluorescent lights reflecting in the bulletproof glass, seeing his own hollow, bruised and aging reflection staring back at him. The sheer weight of his regret finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his stubborn ego. Since I had permanently blocked his phone number the night of his arrest, he had no digital way to reach me. He could not call, he could not text, and he could not email. But the federal restitution paperwork he received every single month listed the legal mailing address of the primary victim. He knew exactly where I lived in Florida. Brandon pulled a cheap piece of lined notebook paper from a spiral binder behind the counter. He took a blue ballpoint pen and began to write. He did not write a manipulative plea for money or a demand for legal salvation. He was far past the point of arrogant bargaining. He wrote a desperate, tear-stained confession. He poured every ounce of his miserable, shattered soul onto that cheap piece of paper. He wrote about the damp concrete floor of the Atlanta basement, acknowledging the sheer cruelty of what he had done to the man who sacrificed everything for him. He wrote about the suffocating loneliness of his windowless boarding room and the painful realization that he had traded a father who loved him for a woman who left him in the dirt at the first sign of trouble. Heavy tears fell from his eyes, smudging the blue ink as his handwriting grew more and more frantic. He begged for a single minute of my time. He begged for a single word of forgiveness, just so he could find a reason to keep waking up every single day. He folded the stained, crumpled paper into a cheap envelope, licked the adhesive, and wrote my Florida address on the front with shaking hands. At the end of his shift, as the cold gray dawn broke over the city, he walked 3 blocks in the freezing rain to drop the envelope into a blue postal box. He stood there shivering in the wet cold, watching the metal lid slam shut, sending his final desperate prayer out into the void. A week later, that very same envelope arrived in my polished brass mailbox, perfectly contrasting the bright, beautiful sunshine of the Florida Gulf Coast. I held the crumpled paper in my hand, staring at my son's frantic handwriting, feeling the heavy weight of his broken spirit right there on my peaceful porch. I stood on my sunlit porch, holding the crumpled, damp envelope in my hand. The cheap, thin paper was heavily stained with what looked like dried tears and smeared raindrops. The return address printed in the top left corner was a generic post office box located in a notoriously dangerous zip code back in Atlanta. But the frantic, messy blue ink scrawled across the front of the envelope was instantly recognizable to me. It was Brandon's handwriting. For a brief moment, the cool, salty ocean breeze blowing off the Gulf of Mexico seemed to stop completely. The envelope felt unnaturally heavy in my hand, carrying the desperate, suffocating weight of a broken man begging for absolute salvation. Any ordinary sentimental father might have felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of parental guilt. They might have hurriedly torn open the glued flap, desperate to read the frantic apologies, incredibly eager to believe that the painful, humiliating lesson had finally transformed their treacherous child into a better, more respectful person. But I was not an ordinary father anymore, and I did not tear open the envelope. I did not run my thumb over the smudged blue ink to feel the physical impression of his desperation. I simply turned my back to the sparkling ocean, walked calmly back inside my heavily air-conditioned house, and headed straight for my quiet home office. I walked over to the heavy-duty industrial cross-cut paper shredder sitting quietly beside my polished mahogany desk. I reached out and flipped the main power switch. The heavy machine hummed to life instantly with a low, steady mechanical growl. I did not hesitate for a single second. I did not hold the envelope up to the bright sunlight streaming through the window to try and read the desperate words bleeding through the thin paper. I simply aligned the bottom edge of the sealed envelope with the narrow feed slot and let go. The sharp, interlocking steel blades grabbed the cheap paper instantly with a violent jerk. The loud, aggressive sound of the shredder completely filled the quiet room as the desperate, tear-stained letter was violently chewed into hundreds of tiny, illegible confetti strips. It took less than 3 seconds for the entire heartbreaking plea to be completely and permanently destroyed. I watched the tiny, shredded pieces fall like snow into the clear plastic bin, mixing harmlessly with old grocery receipts and meaningless junk mail. I pressed the button to turn the machine off. The room fell completely silent once again. I did not feel a sudden crushing rush of sadness. I did not feel the heavy weight of regret settling into my chest. The mechanical shredder had done exactly what I had designed it to do. It had effectively neutralized useless manipulative noise. I sat down in my comfortable leather desk chair and stared at the clear plastic bin full of shredded paper. Society places a massive, completely unreasonable burden on parents to endlessly forgive their children under any and all circumstances. We are constantly told by the world that blood is thicker than water, that family is an unbreakable, sacred bond, and that a father must always leave the front door wide open for a prodigal son to eventually return home. But 40 years of rigorous engineering and complex system design have taught me a much harsher, more realistic truth. If a structural foundation is fundamentally rotten and actively failing, you do not keep building heavy additions on top of it. You do not invite the destructive termites back into your wooden house simply because they happen to share your last name. Blood does not give anyone the divine right to subject you to systematic emotional trauma and severe financial abuse. Sharing my biological DNA did not magically give Brandon the right to forge my name on federal bank documents to steal $250,000 or to actively conspire with his greedy parasitic wife to lock me away in a state psychiatric ward so they could comfortably drain my private retirement funds. True forgiveness is not a mandatory, unconditional gift you blindly hand out just to alleviate someone else's crushing guilt. True forgiveness must be meticulously earned through rigorous, painful accountability, and even then it absolutely does not guarantee readmission into my personal life. Brandon was not writing that letter because he suddenly respected me as a man or a father. He was writing that long, tear-stained letter because his graveyard shift at the gas station was physically miserable because the federal government was mercilessly garnishing his minimum wage paycheck and because he was finally suffering the exact horrifying consequences he had so eagerly designed for me. He desperately wanted me to act as his emotional shock absorber to absorb his massive pain and offer him a clean, comfortable slate. But some specific lines once crossed with such deliberate, calculated malice permanently erase a person from your life completely and forever. The boy I had lovingly raised had died the exact moment he pointed his finger toward that damp, miserable concrete basement in Atlanta. The broken man who wrote that letter was simply a convicted federal felon desperately looking for an easy escape route. By shredding his manipulative words completely unread, I was firmly cementing the absolute impenetrable boundary of my own self-respect. I absolutely refused to let his toxic, infectious desperation breach the peaceful sanctuary I had fought so incredibly hard to build for myself. I stood up from my heavy mahogany desk, picked up the clear plastic shredder bin, and carried it outside to the large municipal recycling container parked in my garage. I aggressively dumped the shredded remnants of my past into the massive bin and closed the heavy plastic lid with a loud, satisfying thud, officially and permanently burying the very final ghost of Atlanta. I walked back into the bright, airy kitchen of my beachfront home and poured myself a tall, fresh glass of sweet iced tea. The absolute, uncompromising finality of my actions brought a profound, crystal-clear sense of clarity to my mind. The heavy, rusty anchor of the past had finally been cut loose, allowing my ship to sail freely toward the bright, open horizon. I walked out onto my massive wooden wraparound porch, feeling the incredibly warm Florida sun radiating against my skin. My new life was absolutely not defined by dark isolation or lingering bitterness. It was defined entirely by the beautiful, deliberate choices I was now completely free to make every single day. I had successfully established a quiet, highly rewarding routine that brought me immense, consistent joy. Every morning I woke up right at sunrise and walked for miles along the pristine white sand beach, listening only to the calling seagulls and the rhythmic crashing ocean waves. I spent my quiet afternoons reading the thick, complex historical biographies I never had the time to finish during my demanding corporate career. I joined a highly active local community center where I played competitive chess with retired military veterans who completely understood the absolute non-negotiable value of personal honor and mutual respect. I had even started happily volunteering my time teaching basic engineering principles and mathematics to eager, respectful high school students at the local vocational academy. They looked up to me not as a financial burden or an endless automated teller machine, but as a wise mentor with decades of incredibly valuable experience. My personal cell phone no longer rang with frantic, screaming demands for money or aggressive disrespect. My polished brass mailbox no longer held forged bank statements or terrifying federal legal notices. The highly toxic, chaotic suburban world of Megan, Gary, Susan, and Brandon was entirely and permanently severed from my reality. They were completely trapped in their miserable, self-inflicted financial purgatory, while I was proudly living the absolute best years of my entire life. I sat down heavily in my comfortable wooden rocking chair, took a long, refreshing sip of my cold iced tea, and watched a small white sailboat glide smoothly across the sparkling blue water of the Gulf. The complete and total destruction of my old life had not left me hollow or empty. It had simply cleared the poisoned land, allowing me to build a magnificent, peaceful fortress where only those who genuinely respected me were ever allowed to enter. I was completely at peace, knowing with absolute certainty that I had executed the ultimate silent adjustment. The warm evening breeze carried the incredibly rich, mouth-watering scent of grilled red snapper and garlic butter across my massive wooden porch. I stood proudly at the head of a long, beautifully decorated outdoor dining table, pouring a crisp white wine into the glass of my new neighbor, a retired naval commander named Thomas. Next to him sat Patricia, a brilliant former university professor who had quickly become a close confidant, and her husband Robert, a retired architectural engineer. The atmosphere was incredibly vibrant, completely filled with genuine laughter, sharp intellectual conversation, and an effortless mutual respect. I was hosting a dinner party, but this was absolutely nothing like the humiliating, sweltering backyard barbecue Megan had forced me to cater back in Atlanta. Nobody here handed me a pair of metal tongs and barked orders. Nobody here mocked my advanced age or whispered cruel, entitled jokes behind my back. These people were my absolute equals. They were highly accomplished, intelligent individuals who deeply valued my 40 years of engineering experience and genuinely enjoyed my company. We clinked our crystal glasses together, toasting to good health and the beautiful Florida weather. I sat down in my comfortable wicker chair, looking around at the smiling faces illuminated by the soft, warm glow of the porch lanterns. They did not care about the size of my bank account or what kind of property they could potentially inherit from me. They simply cared about Charles. The contrast between this deeply fulfilling human connection and the toxic parasitic environment I had successfully escaped was absolutely staggering. I passed a large ceramic platter of fresh roasted asparagus down the table, engaging in a lively, highly technical debate with Thomas about the structural integrity of modern naval vessels. My mind was sharp, my heart was incredibly light, and my home was finally a true sanctuary. Strangers had seamlessly become my real family, entirely replacing the biological relatives who had so eagerly tried to destroy me. As the dinner plates were cleared away and we moved on to drinking rich, dark roast coffee, Patricia leaned across the table and asked how my business meetings in the city had gone earlier that week. I smiled, placing my coffee mug down on the smooth glass table. I proudly explained to my guests that I had officially launched my new philanthropic venture. I did not just use the $800,000 from the corporate real estate buyout to purchase this beautiful beachfront property. I had taken a massive, highly substantial portion of that pure cash and partnered directly with Jonathan Hayes, my ruthless attorney, back in Georgia. Together, we had successfully established a heavily funded, aggressively proactive legal aid foundation. Our exclusive mission was to provide elite, uncompromising legal representation entirely free of charge to elderly victims of financial abuse. I told my friends about our very first major victory. We had just completely dismantled a fraudulent guardianship case where a greedy nephew was actively trying to declare his wealthy aunt mentally incompetent so he could easily steal her commercial real estate portfolio. My foundation swooped in, thoroughly audited the nephew's financial records, proved his malicious intent in federal court, and had him permanently barred from contacting her. Patricia raised her coffee mug in a silent, deeply respectful toast. I explained that I was taking the exact same silent, devastating tactics I had used against Brandon and weaponizing them to protect vulnerable people who could not protect themselves. The massive sum of money my son had desperately wanted to steal to buy luxury cars and fund illegal gambling syndicates was now being systematically used to destroy predators exactly like him. I had found an incredibly profound driving purpose in my retirement. I was no longer just a retired engineer relaxing quietly on a beach. I was an active, highly effective shield for the defenseless, using my sharp mind and my financial leverage to violently balance the scales of justice for those who were quietly suffering in damp basements and lonely nursing homes. The evening slowly wound down. My guests offered warm hugs and sincere thanks before walking down the driveway toward their own homes. I was left completely alone on my massive wooden porch. I did not rush inside to clean the kitchen or clear the table. I simply walked over to the sturdy wooden railing, resting my hands firmly on the smooth surface, and looked out over the vast, dark expanse of the Gulf of Mexico. The silver moonlight danced beautifully across the crashing ocean waves. I stood there in the quiet night, breathing in the clean, salty air, and I searched my heart for any lingering trace of regret. I searched for any hidden sorrow regarding my son, any small whisper of guilt for leaving him to rot in a federal holding cell, and allowing his entire life to completely collapse into crushing poverty. But I found absolutely nothing. There was no guilt, there was no sorrow, there was only a solid, unbreakable core of absolute peace. Society constantly preaches that you must always forgive your family, that you must endlessly endure their emotional and financial abuse simply because you share biological ties. But standing under the bright Florida stars, I knew with absolute certainty that such a philosophy is a dangerous, incredibly toxic lie. Blood does not give anyone a free pass to commit financial treason. It does not excuse severe emotional manipulation, and it certainly does not require me to set myself on fire just to keep my abusers warm. Cutting out the poison is the only way to actually survive. I had amputated the rotting limb of my family tree, and by doing so, I had saved my own life. I am 70 years old, and for the first time, I am completely awake. People often think that reaching this advanced age means your story is entirely finished, that you are supposed to quietly fade into the background and wait for the end. But they are completely wrong. Life truly begins at 70 when you finally strip away the heavy burdens of false obligations and toxic people. Life begins when you realize your own immense power and actively refuse to be treated like an expired commodity. I looked at the beautiful home behind me, the secure foundation I had built with my own 2 hands and my own brilliant mind. I had executed the perfect silent adjustment, and I had emerged completely victorious. The old world of disrespect, forged documents, and damp concrete cellars was entirely severed from my existence. I am Charles Wright, and my true life has only just begun. To the fathers and mothers sitting quietly in cold, damp basements, to the aging parents who are currently being treated like a heavy burden in the very homes they worked their entire lives to purchase, I am speaking directly to you right now. Stop making excuses for the incredibly cruel behavior of your greedy children. Stop pretending that their blatant disrespect is just a temporary phase or a simple misunderstanding. You know the dark truth in your gut, and it is time for you to finally wake up. Do not shed another useless tear for people who see you only as a convenient financial resource waiting to expire. Dry your eyes, stand up, and start moving in absolute silence. Check your legal paperwork immediately. Go to the bank and thoroughly audit your retirement accounts. Secretly verify exactly whose name is listed on the official property deeds, the vehicle titles, and the insurance policies. Look for hidden home equity lines of credit or suspicious power of attorney requests. Do not warn them. Do not threaten them. Do not scream, shout, or demand respect, because toxic predators will only use your emotional reactions to paint you as unstable and unreasonable. The absolute hardest hit never comes with a loud scream. The most devastating, inescapable trap is the one they never see coming. Use your lifetime of wisdom to build a solid, impenetrable legal fortress around your assets, and then let them confidently walk right into the minefield of their own arrogant greed. You owe them absolutely nothing. You owe yourself absolute peace. Now I want to hear directly from you. Did you completely agree with my silent adjustment? Do you believe that my son Brandon and his manipulative wife Megan got exactly what they deserved when the federal authorities finally kicked down their door and took everything they had? Do you think Gary deserved to have his massive truck repossessed and be forced into a rundown trailer park? Or do you think I should have acted like a traditional forgiving father and paid off the massive $250,000 fraudulent loan just to keep my son out of a federal penitentiary? Let me know exactly where you stand in the comments section below. I read every single response, and I genuinely want to know how you would have handled this incredible betrayal. If you have ever had to firmly stand up to deeply toxic family members who completely underestimated your intelligence and your worth, please hit the like button right now to show your support. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story of absolute, uncompromising justice. Share this video with anyone who needs a powerful reminder that their life is incredibly valuable no matter their age. Thank you so much for listening to my journey. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and never be afraid to quietly walk away from the poison. I will see you in the next life story. I also learned a harsh truth about the nature of blind generosity. For years, I believed that shielding my son from financial hardship was the ultimate act of paternal love. I paid off his heavy debts. I bought him a massive house, and I constantly smoothed over the rough edges of his adult life. But true love does not mean removing every single obstacle. By giving him absolutely everything he wanted without requiring him to earn it, I did not build a strong man. I built an entitled, arrogant boy who viewed my sacrifices as his absolute birthright. True generosity must always be balanced with strict accountability, or it simply becomes the fertile soil where parasites grow. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need the courage to finally set their own boundaries today.